Saxon culture and language, the foundation of English. It's a strange thought, isn't it? The words you are thinking with right now, the very structure of the sentences forming in your mind, are not modern inventions. They are ancient things, echoes from a world of wind-whipped coasts, smoky mead halls, and the low, constant gray of a northern sea. We live inside a linguistic house built by people we can barely imagine, a people whose name for themselves might have simply meant the people of the knife. Every time we speak of a house or a boat, of water or the earth, we are unknowingly speaking their language, keeping a flicker of their world alive in our daily breath. This history isn't just about kings and battles long past. It is the story of the very words we use to name our world, a ghost story told by the living. Before we journey back to those misty shores to find the origins of this story, let's just take a quiet moment. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you feel like it. It's always wonderful to see where everyone is listening from. Feel free to post your city or country and the local time as you settle in. It's a nice reminder that while history can feel distant, we're all sharing this moment together right now. Our story does not begin with a grand kingdom or a famous city, but in the damp, shifting borderlands of marsh and sea, where northern Europe slowly dissolves into the cold waters of the North Sea. Picture the coastline of what is now northern Germany and the Netherlands, sometime in the 1st or 2nd century. This isn't a landscape of dramatic cliffs or sunny beaches. It is a place of endless tidal flats, of low, waterlogged plains, and windswept islands that seem to barely cling to existence. The air itself feels heavy with salt and mist, carrying the cries of gulls and the constant rhythmic sigh of the waves. It was here, in this geography of uncertainty, that a people began to coalesce, a loose confederation of Germanic tribes who would one day lend their name to the soul of the English language. They were the Saxons. But they weren't born with that name. Not really. No one is. A name is something you are given, or something you earn, or something that simply sticks. For the Romans, looking out from their comfortable, well-ordered provinces, in Gaul and Britain, the peoples of this wild coast were a chaotic jumble of tribes. They were the Chauci, the Angrivari, the Cherushi, names that are now just footnotes in dusty texts. Yet by the 3rd century, Roman writers start mentioning a new and troublesome group with increasing frequency, the Saxons. The name appears suddenly, a label for the pirates and raiders who were becoming a terrifyingly regular problem along the coast. And here we stumble upon our first little historical mystery. Where did this name come from? The most widely accepted theory, the one that feels right in its simple, brutal practicality, is that it came from their knife. The seax. It wasn't a sword, not a grand weapon for a nobleman, but a long, single-edged blade that was carried by nearly every free man. It was a tool, first and foremost. You could cut rope with it, shape a piece of wood, butcher an animal for the evening meal, but it was also a weapon, a viciously effective blade for the close, desperate fighting that happened on the deck of a raided ship or in the chaos of a coastal skirmish. It was their constant companion, a symbol of their readiness and their self-reliance. It seems the people they raided began to identify them by this iconic weapon. They were the knife men, the people of the Sayax. It's a bit like calling a modern army the riflemen, a name born out of fear and a certain grudging respect for their key piece of equipment. We don't know if they initially called themselves Saxons or if they just gradually adopted the name that their enemies had given them, wearing it like a badge of honor. The first Roman to place them on a map, the great geographer Ptolemy, scribbled their name onto a small patch of land in southern Jutland, the neck of modern-day Denmark. But his maps were more like imaginative sketches than precise charts. What is clear is that this Saxon identity was fluid. It wasn't a nation in our sense, with hard borders and a capital city. It was more like a franchise or a cultural movement. Various tribes and clans along the coast, from the Rhine estuaries up to Denmark, began to adopt the Saxon name and their way of life. And that way of life was increasingly defined by the sea. While their neighbors, the Franks, were more concerned with land and pushed south against the Roman frontier in Gaul, the Saxons turned their faces to the water. They were masters of the shallow sea, builders of long, slender boats propelled by oars and a single square sail. These were not the mighty dragon ships of the later Vikings, but they were fast, agile, and terrifyingly quiet. They could navigate the treacherous sandbanks and hidden estuaries of the coast, striking without warning and vanishing back into the mists before any organized resistance could be mounted. For the settled, wealthy inhabitants of Roman Gaul and Britain, living in their stone villas with their mosaics and heated baths, the sight of those low-slung ships appearing on the horizon was the beginning of a nightmare. These were not soldiers in an army fighting for a political goal. They were opportunists, raiders looking for plunder, cattle, grain, metalwork, and most tragically, people. The slave trade was a brutal and accepted part of the ancient economy, and the Saxons were grimly efficient participants. They were a force of nature as much as a people, an extension of the wild sea they had mastered, washing over the shores of a civilized world that was beginning to show its age. But these sea wolves, these people of the knife, had to come from somewhere. Their lives were not spent entirely on the moving deck of a ship. They had homes and families, fields to tend and cattle to guard. To understand what drove them out onto the water, we have to look back at the land they inhabited, a place that was in a constant, slow-motion battle with the sea. This was not a gentle or giving country. There were no mountains to quarry for stone, few great forests of oak for timber. The primary struggle was for the one thing we take for granted, dry land. The sea was not a friendly neighbor. It was a hungry one, constantly seeking to reclaim the low-lying marshes and plains at high tide and during the furious winter storms that churned the North Sea into a gray chaos. To survive here, you couldn't simply build a house. You first had to build the ground it stood on. This is where we find the most telling feature of their early settlements. The Terp, or as they are called in Germany, the Wurt. A terp is an artificial hill, a man-made island in a sea of marshland, built up slowly and deliberately over generations. They began as small platforms, just high enough to keep a single longhouse safe from a normal flood. But over centuries, as families grew and new buildings were added, the terp expanded. Each generation added its own layers of clay, sod, household waste, and even manure, which compacted into a solid, stable foundation. To live on a terp was to live on the accumulated history of your own ancestors, a literal mound of their existence, raising you just a few precious feet above the grasping water. Archaeology has shown that some of these mounds grew to be enormous, supporting entire villages, their profiles rising like lonely green hills in the vast, flat landscape. Life in one of these villages was an intensely communal affair. Privacy, as we might think of it, was an unknown luxury. The settlement was a tight cluster of long, rectangular halls, timber-framed structures, with walls of wattle and daub and heavy thatched roofs that swept low to the ground to brace against the wind. The heart of the longhouse was the central fire, its smoke filling the rafters, before finding a hole in the roof, staining everything with a permanent earthy scent of wood smoke. Often there was no solid division between humans and their most precious possessions, their animals. A family might live at one end of the hall, while their cattle, sheep, and goats lived at the other. Their shared body heat a vital source of warmth during the brutal, damp winters. This wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a matter of survival. Livestock represented wealth, food, and the insurance policy against famine. The social structure of the people living in these halls was as layered as the terps themselves, though it lacked the rigid bureaucracy of the Roman world they so often raided. We can piece together their society from archaeology, Roman accounts, and much later Saxon law codes. At the top were the nobles, the Ethelingas. Among them, a chieftain or king, assigning, would lead in war. His authority wasn't absolute or hereditary in a straight line. It was earned. He had to be a successful warrior, a man who could lead raids that brought back plunder. Just as importantly, he had to be a ring giver, a generous lord who would distribute that captured wealth, arm rings of gold and silver, fine swords, slaves, to his loyal followers. A king who hoarded wealth or led his men to defeat would soon find his mead hall empty. The backbone of this society was the great class of freemen, the Saorlas. These were the warriors and farmers, the men who owned their own land or held it as part of a clan. They were the ones who owed military service to their lord, forming the shield wall in battle. Their loyalty was a two-way street, an oath of service in exchange for protection and a share of the spoils. This was the man who carried the sayax on his belt, as a matter of course, the master of his own longhouse and family, beholden to his lord but a free man nonetheless. And below them were the unfree, the Theowas. These were slaves. They were people captured in raids on other tribes or on the shores of Britain and Gaul. They might also be Saxons themselves, forced into slavery through debt or as punishment for a crime. They had virtually no rights and performed the hardest labor, a constant, visible reminder of both the fortunes of war and the harsh consequences of failure in this society. The line between being a Ceorl with his own herd and a Theow tending someone else's could be as thin as the outcome of a single battle. Above all, kinship was everything. The extended family, the clan, was the unit that mattered most. It was your clan that would back you in a dispute, your clan that would protect your rights, and your clan that would be honor-bound to seek vengeance if you were wronged or killed. Justice was often a private matter, a cycle of blood feuds that could only be stopped by the payment of a virgild, a man price, a detailed tariff that set the value of a person's life according to their social rank. Killing a noble cost a fortune in cattle and silver. Killing a slave might cost next to nothing. This was the world that shaped them. Harsh, communal, and intensely loyal, but only to their own. It was a world where survival depended on the strength of your kin and the reputation of your leader. A precarious existence that made the gamble of a raiding voyage across the Gray Sea seem like a very reasonable risk indeed. That constant, low-level threat of raiding, which from the Saxon perspective was a perfectly logical career choice, was seen very differently from the other side of the water. For the Roman Empire, it was a systemic problem, a bleeding ulcer along the northern frontier of its vast domain. For centuries, the English Channel and the North Sea had been, for all intents and purposes, a Roman lake. It was a highway for legions, for commerce, for the flow of information and administration that held the province of Britannia to the continental heart of the empire. Now this vital artery was becoming a place of danger. The problem wasn't a single massive invasion force that could be met in a glorious, decisive battle. It was something more insidious, more difficult to counter. It was the maritime equivalent of 1,000 paper cuts. Imagine being a Romano-British farmer on the coast of Kent or Sussex. You live a comfortable, settled life in a stone villa, perhaps with underfloor heating and fine painted plaster on the walls. Your world is one of order, of predictable seasons, of taxes and trade. Then, one morning, a neighbor's farm is a smoldering ruin, the livestock gone, the people vanished. A merchant ship traveling from Gaul, laden with wine and pottery, is found adrift and empty. Fear begins to creep in from the sea, a cold mist of anxiety that changes the way you live. You start to move your valuables inland. You think twice about investing in new buildings. The coastal economy, once prosperous and secure, begins to slowly wither under the pressure of these relentless, unpredictable attacks. Rome's response to this growing crisis was not to retreat, not yet. The empire in the late 3rd and 4th centuries was a wounded giant, but a giant nonetheless, and its instinct was to build. If the frontier was threatened, you fortified it. The result was one of the most ambitious and formidable defensive systems of the ancient world, the Litus Saxonicum, the Saxon shore. This was a chain of massive stone forts built on both sides of the English Channel, a guardian necklace of military power designed to control the sea lanes and protect the vulnerable coastline. There were great forts in Gaul, at Boulogne and Oudenburg, and an even more impressive string of them in Britain, running from the Wash down to the Solent. Places whose names still echo with Roman power: Brancaster, Berg Castle, Richborough, Pevensey, and Porchester. To a band of Saxon raiders, rowing their low-slung ship towards the British coast, the sight of one of these fortresses looming out of the dawn mist must have been a truly awe-inspiring and terrifying spectacle. These were not old, crumbling walls. They were the cutting edge of late Roman military architecture. They had thick, high stone walls, sometimes 20 feet tall or more, punctuated by projecting D-shaped or circular towers. From these towers, Roman artillery, the powerful crossbow-like machines called ballistae, could create lethal overlapping fields of fire, capable of punching a heavy iron bolt through the hull of a wooden ship from hundreds of yards away. Manned by crack units of the Roman army and supported by a fleet, the Classis Britannica, these forts were designed to make coastal raiding an impossibly risky business. They were the empire's shield, a very clear and expensive message to the sea wolves that this coast was protected. And yet, this is where a fascinating historical debate opens up, a mystery hidden in the name itself, the Litus Saxonicum, the Saxon shore. Does that mean the shore attacked by the Saxons, or could it possibly mean the shore settled by the Saxons? For a long time, the first interpretation was taken for granted. These were walls to keep the barbarians out. But a more nuanced and compelling theory has emerged, one that paints a much more complex picture of the relationship between Rome and the Germanic world. The late Roman army was perpetually short of soldiers. To make up the numbers, it had long been the practice to hire barbarians to fight barbarians. Entire tribes were enlisted as auxiliary troops, known as foederati. They were given money, supplies, and often land along the very frontiers they were now paid to defend. Perhaps the Saxon shore forts were not just barriers, perhaps they were also gates. It's possible they functioned as fortified administrative centers, naval bases, and defended ports designed to manage a complex frontier. From a watchtower at Richborough, a Roman commander might see one group of Saxon ships as pirates to be hunted down by the fleet, while another group might be welcomed as foederati, Saxon mercenaries arriving with their families to take up service in the Roman army. We know from archaeological finds that Germanic-style artifacts, including belt buckles and pottery, begin to appear inside and around these forts long before the official end of Roman rule. This suggests that the forts may have been garrisoned not just by Romans, but by the very people they were supposedly built to keep out. The relationship was likely a messy blend of conflict, trade, coexistence, and recruitment. The Saxon shore becomes less of a simple wall and more of a militarized immigration and customs zone. This would explain a great deal about what happens later. The end of Roman Britain was not necessarily a sudden, overwhelming invasion by a totally alien people. It may have been more of a gradual shift in power, where Germanic soldiers, already serving in the Roman army, and their kinsmen, who were now familiar with the island, simply took over as their Roman paymasters disappeared. The great forts of the Saxon shore, built with all the engineering genius of Rome to keep the world in order, stood silent as that order dissolved. Their Roman eagles were taken down, their garrisons melted away, and the walls remained, waiting for new masters to claim them. Those silent, waiting forts did not have to wait for long. The world that had built them was not just defending its borders. It was decaying from within, and the great edifice of Roman Britain was about to crumble. The end, when it came, was not a single, fiery event. It was a slow, quiet unraveling, a process of abandonment that took place over decades. Legions were withdrawn from Britain one by one, summoned back to the continent to deal with more pressing crises, usurpers, civil wars, and the massive movement of Gothic tribes that threatened the heart of the empire itself. The flow of new coins from the imperial mints, the lifeblood of the paid army and administration, slowed to a trickle and then stopped entirely. The final, formal break is traditionally marked by a single document from the year 410. As the Goths were sacking the city of Rome itself, The beleaguered Emperor Honorius sent a letter, a rescript, to the leaders of the British cities. His message was simple, stark, and devastating. You are on your own now. Look to your own defenses. Imagine the profound shock of that. For nearly 400 years, Britain had been a part of a vast, interconnected global superpower. Its defense, its high-level politics, its economy, all were managed by a central authority far away. Now, in a single stroke, that authority was gone. The plug had been pulled. The provincial government evaporated, the army was gone, and the link to the wider world was severed. What was left was a deeply Romanized upper class and a Celtic population living in a land full of Roman things: roads, cities, villas, forts, but with no Romans to run them. A power vacuum opened up, and into it stepped local strongmen, city councils, and regional tyrants, all vying for control. Britain fractured into a patchwork of squabbling petty kingdoms, and they had enemies. From the north, the Picts of what is now Scotland raided down past the line of Hadrian's Wall. From the west, across the Irish Sea, came the Scotti, who would one day give their name to Scotland. The Romano-Britons, with no professional army, were caught in a desperate struggle for survival, squeezed on all sides. It is in this moment of crisis that a figure of immense and tragic importance emerges from the historical gloom. His name, as recorded by later chroniclers, like the British monk Gildas and the Anglo-Saxon Bede, was Vortigern. This may not have been a personal name at all, but a title, meaning something like High King or Overlord. He was, it seems, the most powerful of the Romano-British rulers, a man faced with an impossible situation. Needing to fend off the relentless attacks of the Picts and lacking the soldiers to do it, he made a decision. It was a choice that was both perfectly logical and catastrophically naive. He decided to hire mercenaries, and remembering the old Roman policy, the one that had garrisoned the Saxon shore forts, he knew just where to find the best and most fearsome warriors for hire. He sent an invitation across the sea. The story, as it has come down to us, is thick with the myths of legend, but its outline is stark. Sometime in the middle of the 5th century, 3 Saxon ships, 3 keels, landed on the shores of Kent at a place called Ebbsfleet on the Isle of Thanet. They were led by 2 brothers, chieftains whose names have become legendary, Hengist and Horsa. It's important to see this moment through the eyes of Vortigern and his council. They would not have seen this as the beginning of an invasion. They would have seen it as a business transaction. They were hiring a war band, just as Roman generals had been doing for centuries. These were foederati, specialist contractors brought in to do a dirty job. The deal was simple. Hengist and Horsa and their warriors would fight for Vortigern against the Picts. In exchange, they would be given supplies, payment, and the Isle of Thanet itself, a small, easily defended island on the tip of Kent, as a place to settle. At first, the plan worked brilliantly. The Saxons were ferocious and effective fighters. They met the Picts in battle and drove them back with, as one chronicler grimly puts it, great slaughter. So, Vortigern's gamble appeared to have paid off. He had secured his northern border with a shield of hired swords. But the wolves he had invited in to guard the sheepfold soon developed an appetite. The Saxon warband on Thanet began to grow. Word was sent back to their homeland, carried on the tides to the crowded villages on the Terps. The message was tantalizing. The land across the water is rich and fertile, its soil deep, its rivers full of fish, and its people, the Britons, are weak and divided. More ships began to arrive, not just carrying warriors now, but their families, their belongings, their ambitions. The mercenary camp began to look more and more like a colony. The Saxons began to complain, claiming that their agreed-upon supplies were insufficient, that their monthly payments were not enough for their growing numbers. It was, in all likelihood, a pretext. They saw a land ripe for the taking and a people unable to defend it. The alliance shattered. The demands for more food and more land became threats. And then, the threats became action. The hired guards turned on their employers. Gildas, writing with all the bitterness of a man describing the ruin of his own people, said that a fire, lit in the east, was soon sweeping across the island. The mercenary contract was broken, and the Adventus Saxonum, the arrival of the Saxons, had begun in earnest. The fateful invitation had not just brought a few boatloads of warriors to Britain, it had opened a door, and through that door an entire people were now beginning to pour. That open door, once breached, could not be closed. The initial trickle of mercenaries became a steady flow, and the flow became a flood. The fire that Gildas said was lit in the east now began to spread with terrifying speed, sweeping westwards from the shores of Kent. What had begun as a dispute over rations and pay between a warlord and his hired muscle now escalated into open warfare, a violent struggle for the land itself. The chronicles, written down centuries later by the descendants of these very Saxons, tell the story in a stark, brutal, and heroic fashion, a founding epic for a new people. They tell of great battles, naming the British leaders and the Saxon chieftains. The legendary brothers, Hengist and Horsa, lead the charge. They fight a great battle against Vortigern at a place called Aylesford, and there, in the chaos of the shield wall, Horsa is slain. His death leaves Hengist as the sole leader, a man now driven by vengeance as well as ambition. The story becomes a grim tally of victories. Hengist and his son, Aesk, fight the Britons at a place called Crayford, and the chronicle states, with chilling simplicity, that they slew 4,000 men. The Britons, it says, forsook Kentland, and with much fear fled to London. With each battle, more land is taken, more plunder is won, and the foundations of the first Saxon kingdom, the kingdom of Kent, are laid in blood and iron. It is a powerful story, a clean narrative of conquest and destiny. But here, history becomes slippery, and we must ask a quiet question. Who, really, were Hengist and Horsa? Were these two brothers, the founders of the first English kingdom, real historical figures? Or were they something closer to myth? Their names are a clue. In their own Old English language, Hengist meant stallion, and Horsa simply meant horse. It seems a little too convenient, a little too poetic. It's like discovering the founders of Rome were named Wolf and Wolf Cub instead of Romulus and Remus. Horses were powerful, almost sacred animals in Germanic pagan culture, associated with gods and kings. It's entirely possible that Hengist and Horsa were real men who simply had popular, horse-themed names, but it is just as possible that they were mythological figures, divine horse twins from an old pagan religion, grafted onto the history of the conquest to give it a grand, semi-divine origin. We are looking back through such a dark glass that we will almost certainly never know for sure. While the chronicles give us the legendary, perhaps mythical names of the leaders, it is the earth itself, the soil of Britain, that tells the far more brutal and anonymous story of the conquest. Archaeology replaces the clean lines of the epic with a messy, terrifying reality. In the ruins of Roman towns and villas, archaeologists find a stark piece of evidence: a thick, dark layer of soil filled with charcoal and burned debris. This destruction layer speaks of a sudden, fiery end of wooden roofs collapsing in flames, of civilized places being violently overthrown. At the Roman city of Roxter, a skeleton was found sprawled in the gutter of the last paved street, a man cut down as he tried to flee with a box of coins. This was not a neat handover of power. It was a violent collapse. The cemeteries tell the same story of cultural replacement. For centuries, the people of Roman Britain had been buried in an orderly fashion, often in coffins, their bodies aligned east to west, with few, if any, objects buried with them. Suddenly, in the 5th century, this changes. New cemeteries appear, filled with people buried according to Germanic pagan rites. Men are buried with their weapons, an iron spearhead by their shoulder, the round iron boss of their wooden shield resting on their chest, and almost always that iconic seax knife at their hip. Women are buried with their jewelry, beautiful brooches of gilded bronze to fasten their clothing, strings of amber and glass beads, and intricate belt fittings. This is not the sign of a small warrior elite taking over. This is the sign of a whole people arriving, bringing their culture, their beliefs, and their dead. Sometimes, the evidence is even more direct and horrifying. Skeletons are found not in neat graves, but tossed into wells or ditches, their bones bearing the unmistakable marks of edged weapons. These are the victims, the nameless Britons who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, their violent deaths a silent testament to the reality behind the chronicle's simple phrase, "They slew the Britons." This was the bloodied shore. It was the end of one world and the violent birth of another. The old Romano-British way of life simply vanished. The great pottery kilns that mass-produced tableware went cold. The workshops that made fine jewelry fell silent. The villas, with their heated floors and beautiful mosaics, were abandoned, left to become lonely, collapsing ruins in a landscape that was growing wilder and more dangerous. For the Britons, it was an age of terror and dislocation. Gildas writes of his people being hunted, of them fleeing to the mountains and forests to survive. It was in this period that a great migration began, as thousands of Britons fled the chaos, sailing south across the Channel to the Roman province of Armorica, which would one day be renamed Brittany, Little Britain, in their honor. In one final, desperate act, the leaders of the Britons sent a letter to the most powerful Roman general left in the West. It has become known as the Groan of the Britons. Its words are a cry of pure despair. "The barbarians drive us to the sea," it read. "The sea drives us to the barbarians. Between these two means of death, we are either massacred or drowned." No help came. They truly were on their own now, facing the twilight of their world as the Saxon tide rolled in. The great tide of migration did not wash over Britain as a single uniform wave. It was a messy, chaotic, and piecemeal process. Think of it less as a coordinated invasion by a single army and more like a frontier gold rush. Different ships, carrying different chieftains and their followers, landed at different points along the coast. They were all seeking the same thing: land, wealth, a new home. But they were not a unified force. They were competitors, rivals, adventurers. For decades, the story of southeastern Britain was one of countless small war bands fighting against the native Britons, and very often fighting against each other for the best territory. It was an age of bloody attrition, where small groups were either wiped out, absorbed by their neighbors, or forced to flee. But out of this violent crucible, a slow process of consolidation began. A particularly successful or ruthless chieftain would attract more warriors to his banner. He would seize control of a river valley or a stretch of coastline. He would reward his followers with the spoils of victory, and in doing so, his power would grow. Eventually, he would be strong enough to demand tribute from lesser chieftains, and he would begin to call himself a king. The swirling chaos of the migration was beginning to harden, like cooling lava, into new and stable political shapes. Following the establishment of the Kingdom of Kent, which tradition tells us was founded by Hengist, other Saxon groups began to carve out their own domains along the southern coast. To the west of Kent, along the sunniest stretch of the British coastline, the kingdom of the South Saxons emerged. We call it Sussex. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that great and frustratingly sparse record of the age, tells us that its founder was a chieftain named Aelg, who landed in the year 477 with his 3 sons. Their arrival was said to have been violent, a brutal fight on the beaches against the local Britons. The chronicle tells of Aelg's great victory some years later at the site of the old Roman Saxon shore fort of Pevensey. He besieged the Britons, who had taken refuge within its mighty stone walls, and when it fell, the entry states with a terrible finality: El slew all that were therein, nor was there one Briton left there. So, it is a stark reminder that these founding stories were meant to celebrate a total and ruthless conquest. And yet, like Hengist, Aella hovers in the mist between history and myth. Later writers would call him the first Bretwalda, a title given to a handful of powerful kings who held sway over the other English kingdoms, but there is no contemporary evidence to prove he was real. His kingdom of Sussex would remain a small and somewhat isolated player for most of its history, hemmed in by the sea to the south and the immense dense forest of the Weald to the north. Further north, along the estuary of the River Thames, another kingdom took shape: Essex, the land of the East Saxons. Its origins are even more obscure than those of Sussex. The royal genealogies name its first king as Esquine, but the stories of his deeds are lost to us. It is more likely that the kingdom formed through a gradual fusion of many different Saxon settlements along the rivers and coastal marshes that fed into the Thames. Its position was strategically vital, as it controlled the approaches to the ghostly, half-abandoned Roman city of Londinium. For much of its history, Essex would live in the shadow of its more powerful neighbors, a pawn in the games of the kings of Kent, Mercia, and later Wessex. It is this third kingdom, Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, that was destined for the greatest future. Its birth, however, was a long and difficult one. the West Saxons did not find an easy conquest. Their founding story begins in the year 495 with the arrival of a leader named Cerdic and his son Cynric, who supposedly landed on the coast of what is now Hampshire. From there, they did not sweep across the land in a single campaign. Instead, they began a slow, grinding, multi-generational fight, inland and up the Thames Valley. The Britons in this region seem to have been better organized and offered a far fiercer resistance than elsewhere in the south. The battles recorded in the Chronicle are hard-won victories in a long war of attrition. And here again, we find a fascinating historical puzzle in the name of the founder himself. Cerdic is not a Germanic Saxon name. It is a Brittonic name, a version of the Celtic name Caraticos. This is a strange and revealing detail. Why would the founder of the greatest Saxon kingdom have a British name? One theory is that he was a Saxon who had been born and raised in Britain, perhaps the son of a mercenary who had served in the Roman army. But a more radical and intriguing hypothesis suggests that Cerdic may have been a Romano-British nobleman, a man of mixed heritage, who forged a new power base for himself by leading both British and Saxon warriors. In this version of the story, the founding of Wessex is not a simple tale of foreign conquest, but a much more complex story of cultural fusion and political opportunism, where the lines between Saxon and Britain were not nearly as clear as the later chroniclers wanted us to believe. Whatever their exact origins, these new kingdoms were now a reality on the map of the island. Their very names spoke of their tribal, geographic nature. They were not named for capital cities in the Roman style, but for the people themselves. Sussex for the South Saxons, Essex for the East, Wessex for the West. They were, at this stage, little more than territories controlled by a warrior elite. A king's authority stretched only as far as his warband could ride in a day. They settled the land in a new way, largely abandoning the stone ruins of the Roman cities in favor of their own wooden villages built in the fertile river valleys, slowly drawing a new cultural and political map over the fading ghost of Roman Britain. This new map of Britain, being drawn with the sharp edges of swords and the patient furrows of plows, was not an exclusively Saxon creation. The Saxons, while dominant in the south, were not the only Germanic people who had answered the siren call of a rich and leaderless land. The old Roman and British writers who watched this migration with fear spoke of three kindred peoples who came across the sea: the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes. These were not neat and tidy distinctions. They were all North Sea peoples, sharing a similar language, culture, and a grimly practical pagan faith. But they came from slightly different corners of the continental coastline and settled in different parts of the island, eventually giving rise to their own distinct kingdoms. We have seen the Saxons establishing their territories in the south and west. According to the venerable historian Bede, writing much later, the people who settled in Kent, the very first of these new kingdoms, were not Saxons, but Jutes, a people from the peninsula of modern Denmark. Their proximity to the coast of Frankish Gaul meant that Kent would always be a little different from its neighbors, wealthier from trade, more open to continental ideas, and the first place where the light of a new religion would eventually land. But the largest territories of all were settled by the Angles, who traditionally came from the Angoln Peninsula, right on the border of modern Germany and Denmark. They settled in a great swathe up the eastern coast and across the middle of the island. In the fens and flatlands of the east, they founded the kingdom of East Anglia, the land of the East Angles. This was a rich agricultural kingdom, but also a mysterious one, a land of marshes and winding rivers. It is from here that we have one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries ever made in Britain, the Sutton Hoo ship burial. An entire longship was dragged ashore and buried in the earth as the final resting place for a great king, filled with an astonishing treasure of gold and garnet jewelry, silver bowls from Byzantium, and a magnificent warrior's helmet, its face masked and inscrutable. It is a silent, breathtaking glimpse into the wealth and far-reaching connections of these supposedly isolated barbarian kings. To the north, the Angles established the vast kingdom of Northumbria, stretching from the Humber estuary all the way up into what is now southern Scotland. It was a union of two earlier, smaller kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira, and its sheer size made it one of the dominant powers on the island for a very long time. And in the very center of it all, the heartland of the island, arose the kingdom of Mercia, the borderland. Its central position meant it was in a state of almost perpetual conflict with every single one of its neighbors. Under powerful and ambitious kings, Mercia would become the aggressive, military superpower of the age, constantly pushing its borders outwards. So now, the pieces are on the board. In the south, you have the Saxons of Wessex, Sussex, and Essex, and the Jutes of Kent. In the east and north, the Angles of East Anglia and Northumbria, and in the middle, the Angles of Mercia. 7 kingdoms. This collection of rival states has become known to history as the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, a Greek term meaning the rule of 7. It's a convenient label, and it paints a neat picture of a stable system of 7 parallel kingdoms. But the reality, as is so often the case, was much, much messier. The term Heptarchy wasn't used at the time. It was invented by a historian 1,000 years later. In truth, the political situation was constantly in flux. The number of kingdoms was not always as 7. Smaller territories, like the Kingdom of Lindsey or the Huisi, would pop in and out of existence, independent for a generation before being swallowed by a more powerful neighbor. Furthermore, these kingdoms were never equals. It was less a balanced council of 7 and more like a sports league with different divisions. At any given time, there were usually only 2 or 3 major powers. At first Northumbria, then Mercia, and finally Wessex, who competed for the top spot. The smaller kingdoms, like Sussex, Essex, and East Anglia, spent most of their time trying to stay out of the way, often forced to pay tribute and accept the overlordship of whichever of their neighbors was strongest. The so-called Heptarchy was, in reality, a brutal and chaotic free-for-all, a political landscape defined by shifting alliances, sudden betrayals, and constant attritional warfare. To describe this shifting balance of power, the Anglo-Saxons had a concept of their own, the Bretwalda. This was an Old English title, meaning something like Britain ruler or wide ruler. It was a term of respect given to a king who, through force of arms and political cunning, had managed to establish his dominance over most of the other kingdoms. A Bretwalda was the unofficial king of kings, the man at the top of the pyramid. When he called, the other kings had to answer. But it was a personal and temporary power. It was not an institution or a formal office. It belonged to the man, not the crown. When a powerful Bretwalda died, his empire often died with him, and the bloody struggle for supremacy would begin all over again. This was the world the Anglo-Saxons made, a patchwork of restless, rival kingdoms whose pagan kings schemed and fought for the fleeting glory of being the master of a newly forged and violent land. This violent, competitive world of the Heptarchy was not managed from a central bureaucracy or a stone-built capital city. The engine room of Anglo-Saxon political and social life, the very heart of each kingdom, was the king's great timber hall. For a traveler moving through the landscape of the 6th or 7th century, a landscape of scattered hamlets and vast, dark forests, the sight of a king's royal estate, or tun, would have been unmistakable, and at its center, dwarfing every other building, would stand the hall, a monument of wood and thatch, its high gabled roof visible for miles around. This was not just where the king lived, it was the physical embodiment of his power and the cultural center of his people. Let us imagine pushing open the heavy, iron-bound wooden doors and stepping inside. The change from the outside world is immediate and overwhelming. Your eyes would struggle to adjust to the gloom, a long, cavernous space, its dimensions lost in the smoke that coils and eddies up towards a simple hole in the roof. The air is thick with the smells of roasting meat, of sweat, of wet wool, of spilled ale, and above all, the rich, earthy scent of the wood smoke from the long fire pit that runs down the center of the hall. As your eyes adapt, you would see the scene illuminated by the flickering, dancing light of the flames. Long benches, the mead benches of the poems, stretching down either side of the hall, crowded with the king's warriors, his thanes. Their faces are bearded and ruddy in the firelight, their laughter and boasts loud, the sound punctuated by the clang of drinking horns on the wooden tables. At the far end, raised on a dais, sits the king on his high seat, his gift throne. He is not a distant, abstract ruler, but the very present center of this loud and boisterous family. Close to him sit his most trusted champions, his inner circle, and moving through the hall, a figure of grace and diplomacy, is the queen, the peace weaver, carrying a great decorated horn, offering mead to the warriors, forging bonds of courtesy in a world of men defined by brutal strength. This hall was a multi-purpose machine for projecting power. It was a banqueting hall where loyalty was celebrated, a barracks where the king's warband lived and slept, a court where justice was dispensed and disputes were settled, and a treasury where the gold, jewels, and fine weapons won in battle were displayed for all to see. The social glue that held this entire system together was a powerful code of honor, an unwritten contract between the Lord and his men. The king was known as the Begifa, the ring giver. His primary duty was to be generous. From his hoard of treasure, he was expected to reward his loyal followers with gifts, rings of gold and silver to be worn on the arm, fine swords with patterned blades, helmets, and mail shirts. This was not just payment. It was a sacred bond. In return for the Lord's generosity and protection, the Thin owed him a single, simple thing: absolute loyalty. He was expected to fight for his Lord in the shield wall, to protect his body with his own, and if his Lord was killed, he was honor-bound to either avenge him or die fighting. To survive your lord in a battle where he fell was the greatest shame imaginable, a disgrace that would follow you for the rest of your days. This entire worldview, this heroic code of the mead hall, was captured and broadcast by a vital figure in the king's court, the scop. The scop was the court poet, the shaper of tales. He was not mere entertainment. Accompanied by the gentle, hypnotic strumming of a small harp, he was the keeper of the collective memory. He would chant the long genealogies of the kings, tracing their lineage all the way back to the great god Woden, thus legitimizing their rule. He would sing of the great heroes of the past, of their courage and their tragic fates, and he would compose new songs celebrating the victories and generosity of his own living lord. His job was to create fame, an honorable reputation, which in a pre-literate pagan world was the only form of immortality a warrior could hope for. We have one supreme masterpiece of this tradition, an echo from a lost world, the epic poem Beowulf. Though it was written down by Christian monks centuries later, it breathes the very air of the pagan mead hall. It tells the story of a great hero who sails to Denmark to save the king's magnificent hall, Heorot, from a terrifying monster named Grendel. The world of Beowulf is a perfect reflection of the heroic code. The king, Hrothgar, is a wise and generous ring-giver, but his power is useless against the monster. Beowulf is the perfect thane, loyal and courageous, seeking fame. The poem is filled with the celebration of treasure, the importance of lineage, and a deep, fatalistic sense that even the greatest hero must eventually be defeated by his fate. Interestingly, the poem is set entirely in Scandinavia, not England. It is a nostalgic look back, a memory of the continental homeland, a vision of the heroic society that the Anglo-Saxons believed they had come from. It is their Iliad and their Odyssey, a foundational story that, while full of monsters and dragons, gives us a priceless, intimate look at the values that animated the smoky, fire-lit world of the mead hall, a small island of warmth and light in a dark, cold, and very dangerous world. That dark, cold, and dangerous world that existed outside the fire-lit circle of the mead hall was not just populated by rival war bands and the wild beasts of the forest. To the pagan Anglo-Saxons, the world was alive with unseen forces, a place humming with an ancient and powerful magic. Every stream had its spirit, every ancient stone its memory, every dark grove of trees a sacred and sometimes terrifying presence. Their religion was not a matter of weekly services and quiet contemplation. It was a constant daily negotiation with a world of powerful, unpredictable, and often dangerous supernatural forces. Trying to understand the precise details of their beliefs is like trying to reassemble a shattered mirror. The Anglo-Saxon pagans themselves wrote nothing down. Their faith was one of oral tradition, of stories and poems chanted by the scop, of rituals performed at certain times of the year under an open sky. Almost everything we know about their gods and goddesses comes to us through the filtered lens of the Christian monks who came later and sought to stamp out this very religion. They wrote about it with a mixture of scholarly curiosity and pious horror. We are left to piece together the truth from their hostile accounts, from the faint echoes and place names, and by looking at the much richer, more detailed stories of their cousins, the Norse Vikings, whose mythology was written down much later but sprang from the same Germanic roots. Despite the fog of the centuries, the great gods have left their names embedded in the very structure of our week. Tuesday is Tao's Day. Tu was a god of war and of justice, an ancient and honorable deity, perhaps once the chief of all the gods. His defining myth tells of how he sacrificed his own hand, placing it in the mouth of the monstrous wolf Fenrir as a pledge, in order to trick the beast so it could be bound and the world could be made safe. He is the god of the selfless sacrifice, of courage, and of keeping one's word, even when the cost is terrible. Wednesday is Woden's Day. Woden, the Norse Odin, was the chief of the gods, the All-Father, but he was not a comforting, benevolent father figure. He was a complex, inscrutable, and dangerous god. He was the god of kings and the ancestor of their royal lines, but he was also the god of frenzy, of magic, of poetry, and of the dead. He was a relentless seeker of knowledge, famously trading one of his eyes for a drink from a well of cosmic wisdom. He is often depicted as a wanderer, cloaked and hooded, a master of secrets and runes who could bestow victory on his favorites, or just as easily demand their lives in sacrifice. Thursday is Thunar's Day. Thunar, the Norse Thor, was a far more straightforward and popular deity. He was the god of the common warrior and the farmer, a champion of mankind. He was a bluff, powerful figure with a great red beard, possessed of a volcanic temper and a prodigious appetite. He was the god of thunder, his mighty hammer Mjolnir, creating the lightning as he rode his chariot across the sky to do battle with the giants and monsters who threatened the world of gods and men. While Woden was the god of the cunning king, Thunor was the god of the strong arm and the loyal heart. And Friday is Freg's Day, named for Woden's wife, Frigg, a powerful goddess of love, marriage, and the household, a weaver of destinies, and a keeper of secrets. Other, more mysterious deities existed, like the spring goddess Eostre, whose name is now attached to the Christian festival of Easter, a faint memory of the pagan feasts that once celebrated the return of the sun. But the world was not just governed by these great gods. The landscape itself teemed with other beings. There were the Elfa, the elves, who could be either dazzlingly beautiful and helpful, or sinister, disease-causing spirits who could shoot a victim with an invisible elf shot. There were the Dweorgus, the dwarves, master smiths who lived under the earth, and there were the monsters of the wilderness, the Eotinas or giants, and the Draken, the great dragons who jealously guarded their ancient treasure hoards. This was the world Beowulf inhabited, a world where a hero could feast in the king's hall one night and do battle with a monster from the fens the next. Tying this entire belief system together was one all-powerful concept, word. We often translate word as fate, but it was much more complex than simple predestination. Word was the underlying principle of the universe, an impersonal and unstoppable force, like a great cosmic river, carrying everything, people, monsters, and even the gods themselves, towards a predetermined end. The gods were not all powerful. They too were doomed to die in a final, cataclysmic battle. Since a person's ultimate destiny was already decided, woven into the great tapestry of word, the only thing that mattered was the manner in which you faced it. Courage in the face of this unchangeable fate was the highest virtue. Your doom was certain, but your glory, your reputation for bravery that the Scop would sing about for generations, was something you could win for yourself. It was this deep, heroic pessimism that lay at the very core of their pagan world, a worldview about to be challenged by a new story from a sunnier land, a story of hope, redemption, and a single God who claimed to be more powerful than fate itself. That new story, the one that would challenge the fatalistic world of Woden and Wyrd, began its journey not in a northern forest, but in a city of sun-bleached stone and ancient ghosts. It began in Rome. The Rome of the late 6th century was not the gleaming marble heart of a global empire. The great palaces of the Caesars were crumbling, the forums were overgrown, and the vast population had shrunk to a shadow of its former glory. It was a city haunted by its own magnificent past. But from these ruins, a new kind of power was rising. This was the power of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and the man who held that office at this time was one of the most remarkable figures of the age, Gregory the Great. Gregory was a man of profound faith, but he was no dreamy ascetic. He was a brilliant administrator, a skilled diplomat, and a deeply practical leader who was trying to maintain the light of civilization in a world that seemed to be sliding into a dark age. He had once been the prefect of the city, its highest civil official, so he knew how the world worked, and for a long time his gaze had been drawn to the farthest, mistiest corner of the old Roman world, the lost province of Britannia. The story of how his gaze sharpened into a focused, ambitious plan is one of the most famous and charming in all of early medieval history. The story, beautifully told a century later by the English historian Bede, takes place before Gregory was pope. He was walking one day through the Roman Forum, which was no longer a place of grand political speeches, but a bustling, chaotic public market. There, amidst the stalls selling wine and grain, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A group of human beings being sold as slaves. This was a grimly common sight, but these slaves were different. They were young boys, and unlike the dark-haired, olive-skinned peoples of the Mediterranean, they had startlingly fair skin, fine features, and shocks of beautiful blonde hair. Intrigued, Gregory approached their owner and began to ask questions. "From what country have these boys been brought?" he asked. The merchant replied, "They are from Britain, and the people of that island all have this appearance." Gregory then asked if these fair-haired people were Christians or if they were still trapped in the darkness of paganism. "They are pagans," came the sad reply. Gregory, Bede tells us, sighed from the bottom of his heart. "Alas, what a pity," he said, "that the author of darkness is possessed of men of such fair countenance." He continued his questions, his mind already working. "What is the name of their people?" The merchant told him, "They are called Angles." And here, a light of divine inspiration is said to have flashed in Gregory's mind. He saw in their name a hidden, this heavenly meaning. "Non angli, sed angeli," he famously declared. "Not angles, but angels. It is fitting that they should become co-heirs with the angels in heaven." His curiosity was now fully alight. "And what is the name of the province from which they were brought?" he asked. The answer was Deira, the southern half of the great northern kingdom of Northumbria. Gregory seized on the name. "They must be rescued to Iridae," he said, from the wrath of God. One final question. Who is the king of that land? The merchant replied that his name was Aella. For Gregory, this final name was a sign. In Aella, he heard the echo of Alleluia. The praise of God the Creator, he declared, must be sung in those distant parts. It is a wonderful story, so perfect and poetic that it is almost certainly not a literal, historical fact. It is far more likely a beautiful parable, a foundational myth crafted later to show that the mission to the English was inspired directly by God. But whether it happened in fact or not, it expresses a deeper truth. Gregory was a man who possessed both a profound compassion and a grand strategic vision. He saw the pagan Anglo-Saxon kingdoms not as a terrifying enemy, but as a potential new flock, a people to be saved. His motivations were also, of course, deeply practical. The most powerful force in Western Europe was the kingdom of the Franks in Gaul, and they were Orthodox Catholics. Bringing the Anglo-Saxons into the fold of the Roman Church would create a new Christian bloc in the north, expanding the spiritual authority of the papacy and strengthening its hand against rivals in the east. Crucially, he had a diplomatic opening. The most powerful king in southern Britain at the time, Ethelbert of Kent, had married a Christian princess from the Frankish royal house named Bertha. As part of the marriage agreement, she had been allowed to bring her own priest and worship at an old, disused Roman church in Ethelbert's capital of Canterbury. There was already a tiny Christian candle flickering in the heart of a pagan kingdom. Years later, now as Pope, Gregory decided it was time to act on his long-held ambition. He chose a man named Augustine, the prior of his own monastery in Rome, to lead the mission. In the year 596, this small band of about 40 monks set out from the familiar, sun-warmed world of Italy on a journey to the very edge of the map. They were heading into a land their Roman ancestors had known only as a source of savage pirates and unending rain, a place of dark forests and the strange guttural tongue of the children of Woden. They were not soldiers, but scholars. Their weapons were not swords and spears, but books, relics, and a story they believed could change the world. The journey from the heart of the old empire to its farthest forgotten shore was a long and frightening one. As Augustine and his small band of monks traveled north through the Frankish kingdoms of Gaul, the world they knew began to fall away, replaced by vast, dense forests and a culture that, while Christian, felt rougher and wilder than their native Italy. Here, they began to hear stories about the people they were being sent to convert. The Anglo-Saxons, they were told, were not just pagans, they were savages, a fierce and barbarous people with a thirst for cruelty. A cold dread began to settle on the mission. The scale of their task, the sheer alien nature of the world they were entering, became terrifyingly real. This fear grew so great that the mission faltered before it had even truly begun. Halting in southern Gaul, the monks sent Augustine back to Rome, begging Pope Gregory to release them from this terrifying, and they felt, impossible duty. They had lost their nerve. Gregory, however, was not a man to be deterred. He listened and then sent Augustine back with a letter that was part papal command, part gentle encouragement, and part stern pep talk. He reminded them of the eternal glory they would win, and urged them not to be frightened by the journey or the tales of men. Bolstered by their leader's unshakable resolve, the monks dutifully, and no doubt nervously, resumed their journey north. In the spring of the year 597, they finally crossed the narrow sea. They landed, as tradition holds, on the Isle of Thanet in Kent, the very same strip of land where the first Saxon war bands of Hengist and Horsa were said to have made their beachhead a century and a half before. But this was a very different kind of landing party. They did not carry swords and shields. Their ships were not filled with warriors hungry for plunder. At the head of their small procession, one monk carried a tall silver cross. Another held aloft a wooden panel, a painted icon of Christ the King. They had come not to conquer a kingdom, but to win its soul. Augustine, acting with careful diplomacy, did not march straight to the king's hall in Canterbury. He sent a message to King Ethelbert, announcing that they had come from Rome and that they brought with them the best of all news, a promise of eternal joy and a kingdom without end for those who would accept it. Ethelbert, the pagan king, the descendant of Woden, was now in a very delicate position. He was intrigued, but deeply suspicious. He was also, we must remember, a man who had been living for years with his Christian wife, Queen Bertha. He was no stranger to this faith, though he had not embraced it himself. He agreed to meet the strangers. With a canny pagan caution, the king insisted that the meeting should not take place in any hall or building, but in the open air. The old belief held that if these newcomers were practitioners of evil magic or sorcery, their powers would be diminished and dispersed under the wide open sky. And so the scene was set for one of the most pivotal encounters in English history. On a green hillside in Kent, King Ethelbert sat with his retinue of bearded armed Thanes, waiting. They watched as a strange, solemn procession approached. The Roman monks, dressed in dark robes, advanced in a slow and orderly line, chanting a litany in their foreign Latin tongue, the silver cross and the painted image of their God-man held high before them. It was a moment of pure spiritual theater, a carefully staged collision of two entirely different worlds. Through Frankish interpreters who could speak both Latin and the Old English of Kent, Augustine began to preach. He told the king and his warriors the story of the Christian faith. He spoke of one all-powerful, all-loving God who had created the heavens and the earth. He told them of Jesus, the Son of this God, who had come to earth to live as a man and to die to save humanity from its sins. And he promised that for those who believed and were baptized, the brief, hard life of this world was merely a prelude to an eternal kingdom of light and joy in the next. Imagine how this message must have sounded to the ears of Ethelbert's warriors. In place of their pantheon of flawed, unpredictable, and often warring gods, Augustine offered a single, perfect, and loving one. In place of the bleak, unchangeable dominion of weird, he offered the hope of a glorious afterlife that was not dependent on fate, but on faith. In place of the warrior's dream of a glorious death in battle, he spoke of humility, forgiveness, and peace. When Augustine had finished, the king gave a reply that was a masterpiece of cautious political wisdom. "Your words and your promises are very fair," he said, according to Bede, "but they are new to us and of uncertain meaning. I cannot approve of them so far as to forsake that which I have so long followed with the whole English nation." It was a polite but firm refusal to make a rash decision. Yet he did not send them away. "Because you have come from far as strangers," he continued, "and have taken pains to communicate to us What you believe to be true and good, you may be sure we shall not molest you. We shall see that you are supplied with all things necessary, and we will not forbid you to preach and win any people you can to your religion. This was the crucial breakthrough. It was not a conversion, but it was an open door. Ethelbert gave them a house in his capital of Canterbury and permission to preach. Was this the first stirring of a genuine faith in the king's heart? Or was it a shrewd political calculation? By adopting the sophisticated, literate religion of his powerful Frankish neighbors and the prestigious ancient city of Rome, Ethelbert knew he would raise his own status, becoming a preeminent king among his pagan peers. We will never know his true motives, but they were likely a complex mix of the spiritual and the political. The monks lived a simple, prayerful life in Canterbury, and their quiet sincerity impressed the people. Later that year, the king, having watched and listened, finally made his choice. Ethelbert of Kent was baptized, the first Anglo-Saxon king to accept the Christian faith, and the long, slow, and difficult process of converting a nation had begun. The baptism of a king was a momentous event, but it did not mean the work of conversion was over. It meant it had just begun. The Roman mission, having secured its beachhead in the southern kingdom of Kent, began the slow, patient work of spreading the faith. But Augustine and his followers were not the only Christians at work in the Anglo-Saxon world. The story of England's conversion was not a single, linear narrative. It was a tale of two very different missions, advancing from two different directions, which were destined to meet and clash in the middle. While the Roman missionaries worked their way north from Canterbury, another entirely separate Christian tradition was flowing into England from the west. This was the Celtic, or Irish form of Christianity. The island of Ireland had never been conquered by Rome, and its church had developed in relative isolation, creating a unique and vibrant Christian culture. It was a faith centered not on powerful bishops ruling from cities, but on great remote monasteries led by holy abbots. These monasteries, like the famous one on the windswept island of Iona off the coast of Scotland, were incredible centers of learning, art, and ascetic piety, and their monks were possessed of a legendary missionary zeal. It was this Irish tradition that would convert the great pagan kingdoms of the north. A pious king of Northumbria named Oswald, who had spent years in exile on Iona, invited monks from there to come and preach to his people. The first missionary was too harsh and failed, but the second, a gentle and deeply holy man named Aidan, was a spectacular success. He founded a new monastery on an island that would become as famous as Iona itself, Lindisfarne, the Holy Island, a place of wind and sea and sky. From this base, Aidan and his fellow Irish monks traveled the length and breadth of Northumbria, winning the trust of the pagan people through their humility and sincerity. And so, a strange situation developed. The church in the south of England looked to Rome for its authority and customs. The powerful and flourishing church in the north looked to Iona and the traditions of the Celtic saints. A spiritual fault line was running right through the heart of the Heptarchy. For a long time, this didn't matter, but as the two traditions began to overlap, their differences became a source of friction. To us, these differences can seem minor, almost trivial, One of the most significant was the tonsure, the haircut worn by the monks. The Romans shaved the crown of the head in a circle, said to represent the crown of thorns. The Celtic monks shaved the entire front of their head from ear to ear. It was a visible sign of allegiance, like wearing a different uniform. The most serious point of contention, however, was the date of Easter, because the two churches used different, ancient calculations to determine the date of the spring equinox. They often celebrated the most important festival of the Christian year on different Sundays. This was no small matter. It could lead to the absurd situation where a king and his court, following the Roman custom, might be celebrating the joyous feast of the resurrection, while his queen, raised in the Celtic tradition, was still in the middle of the solemn, penitential fasting of Lent. For a society that valued unity and order, this was an intolerable confusion. The issue came to a head in the year 664 in the kingdom of Northumbria. The king, Oswiu, decided that this division could not continue. He called a great meeting, a synod, to be held at the monastery of Whitby, a great double abbey for both monks and nuns, which was ruled by one of the most powerful women of the age, the Abbess Hilda. Here, the two sides would formally debate their case, and the king would make a final, binding decision. It was a dramatic confrontation. Arguing for the Celtic tradition was Bishop Colman, a man from Lindisfarne, who made an emotional and heartfelt appeal to the authority of his predecessors, the beloved Saint Aidan and the great Saint Columba, the founder of Iona. Arguing for the Roman cause was a brilliant, ambitious, and somewhat abrasive churchman named Wilfrid. Wilfrid dismissed the Celtic traditions as the stubborn practices of a few people isolated on the edge of the world. He argued for the authority of the universal church, the Church of Rome, which he claimed held its authority directly from the chief of the apostles, St. Peter. The climax of the debate, as recorded by Bede, came when Wilfrid quoted the words of Christ to Peter from the Gospel of Matthew. "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven." When Wilfrid had finished, King Oswiu turned to Bishop Colman and asked a simple, clever question. "Is it true," he asked, "that these words were spoken to Peter by our Lord?" Colman had to admit that it was true. "And can you show any such power given to your Columba?" The bishop had to admit that he could not. The king then delivered his verdict, a decision of shrewd, practical piety. "I tell you," he declared, "Peter is the guardian of the gates of heaven, and I will not contradict him. I will obey his decrees in all things, lest when I arrive at the gates, there may be no one to open them for me." The decision was made. The Northumbrian church, and by extension, all the Anglo-Saxon churches, would adopt the Roman customs for calculating Easter and would align themselves with the authority of the Pope. Colman and those of his Irish brethren who could not accept the ruling in good conscience packed their belongings and withdrew peacefully back to Iona. The Synod of Whitby was a pivotal moment. It was about much more than haircuts and calendars. The decision ensured that the English church would not develop in isolation. It reconnected the island to the mainstream of European Christian life, opening it up to the vast intellectual, artistic, and administrative resources of the Roman world. It helped to forge a sense of a single English church that would in time help create the idea of a single English nation. The two streams of Christianity had met, and now they would flow forward as one. The baptism of a king was a momentous event, but it did not mean the work of conversion was over. It meant it had just begun. The Roman mission, having secured its beachhead in the southern kingdom of Kent, began the slow, patient work of spreading the faith. But Augustine and his followers were not the only Christians at work in the Anglo-Saxon world. The story of England's conversion was not a single linear narrative. It was a tale of two very different missions, advancing from two different directions, which were destined to meet and clash in the middle. While the Roman missionaries worked their way north from Canterbury, another entirely separate Christian tradition was flowing into England from the west. This was the Celtic, or Irish form of Christianity. The island of Ireland had never been conquered by Rome, and its church had developed in relative isolation, creating a unique and vibrant Christian culture. It was a faith centered not on powerful bishops ruling from cities, but on great remote monasteries led by holy abbots. These monasteries, like the famous one on the windswept island of Iona off the coast of Scotland, were incredible centers of learning, art, and ascetic piety, and their monks were possessed of a legendary missionary zeal. It was this Irish tradition that would convert the great pagan kingdoms of the north. A pious king of Northumbria named Oswald, who had spent years in exile on Iona, invited monks from there to come and preach to his people. The first missionary was too harsh and failed, but the second, a gentle and deeply holy man named Aidan, was a spectacular success. He founded a new monastery on an island that would become as famous as Iona itself, Lindisfarne, the Holy Island, a place of wind and sea and sky. From this base, Aidan and his fellow Irish monks traveled the length and breadth of Northumbria, winning the trust of the pagan people through their humility and sincerity. And so a strange situation developed. The church in the south of England looked to Rome for its authority and customs. The powerful and flourishing church in the north looked to Iona and the traditions of the Celtic saints. A spiritual fault line was running right through the heart of the Heptarchy. For a long time, this didn't matter, but as the two traditions began to overlap, their differences became a source of friction. To us, these differences can seem minor, almost trivial. One of the most significant was the tonsure, the haircut worn by the monks. The Romans shaved the crown of the head in a circle, said to represent the crown of thorns. The Celtic monks shaved the entire front of their head from ear to ear. It was a visible sign of allegiance, like wearing a different uniform. The most serious point of contention, however, was the date of Easter, because the two churches used different, ancient calculations to determine the date of the spring equinox. They often celebrated the most important festival of the Christian year on different Sundays. This was no small matter. It could lead to the absurd situation where a king and his court, following the Roman custom, might be celebrating the joyous feast of the resurrection, while his queen, raised in the Celtic tradition, was still in the middle of the solemn, penitential fasting of Lent. For a society that valued unity and order, this was an intolerable confusion. The issue came to a head in the year 664 in the kingdom of Northumbria, The king, Oswiu, decided that this division could not continue. He called a great meeting, a synod, to be held at the monastery of Whitby, a great double abbey for both monks and nuns, which was ruled by one of the most powerful women of the age, the Abbess Hilda. Here, the two sides would formally debate their case, and the king would make a final, binding decision. It was a dramatic confrontation. Arguing for the Celtic tradition was Bishop Colman, a man from Lindisfarne, who made an emotional and heartfelt appeal to the authority of his predecessors, the beloved Saint Aidan and the great Saint Columba, the founder of Iona. Arguing for the Roman cause was a brilliant, ambitious, and somewhat abrasive churchman named Wilfrid. Wilfrid dismissed the Celtic traditions as the stubborn practices of a few people isolated on the edge of the world. He argued for the authority of the universal church, the Church of Rome, which he claimed held its authority directly from the chief of the apostles, Saint Peter. The climax of the debate, as recorded by Bede, came when Wilfrid quoted the words of Christ to Peter from the Gospel of Matthew. "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven." When Wilfrid had finished, King Oswiu turned to Bishop Colman and asked a simple, clever question. "Is it true," he asked, "that these words were spoken to Peter by our Lord?" Colman had to admit that it was true. "And can you show any such power given to your Columba?" The bishop had to admit that he could not. The king then delivered his verdict, a decision of shrewd, practical piety. "I tell you," he declared, "Peter is the guardian of the gates of heaven, and I will not contradict him. I will obey his decrees in all things, lest when I arrive at the gates, there may be no one to open them for me." The decision was made. The Northumbrian Church, and by extension, all the Anglo-Saxon churches, would adopt the Roman customs for calculating Easter and would align themselves with the authority of the Pope. Colman and those of his Irish brethren who could not accept the ruling in good conscience packed their belongings and withdrew peacefully back to Iona. The Synod of Whitby was a pivotal moment. It was about much more than haircuts and calendars. The decision ensured that the English Church would not develop in isolation. It reconnected the island to the mainstream of European Christian life, opening it up to the vast intellectual, artistic, and administrative resources of the Roman world. It helped to forge a sense of a single English church that would, in time, help create the idea of a single English nation. The two streams of Christianity had met, and now they would flow forward as one. The decision at Whitby did more than unify a divided church. It acted like a sudden opening of floodgates. By firmly aligning itself with Rome, the English Church was reconnected to the deep, powerful currents of European learning and culture. A new wave of churchmen and scholars began to arrive from the continent, bringing with them not only new ideas, but also something even more precious: books. Men like Theodore of Tarsus, an elderly and profoundly learned Greek scholar who became the Archbishop of Canterbury, established schools and brought with them the traditions of classical education that had been all but lost in Britain. And it was in the north, in the kingdom of Northumbria, that had hosted the great debate, that this new energy flowered into a spectacular and unexpected golden age. The engine rooms of this cultural flourishing were the great monasteries. On the wild, wind-battered coast of Northumbria, a nobleman turned monk named Benedict Biscop founded the twin monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow. He was a passionate and obsessive collector, making no fewer than 6 perilous journeys to Rome and returning each time with a treasure trove of books, relics, and artworks, transforming his remote northern outposts into 2 of the greatest centers of learning in all of Western Europe. It was here, in the quiet, disciplined world of the monastery, in a room known as the scriptorium, that a new kind of work was done, a battle fought not with swords, but with ink and parchment. Imagine a long, cold stone room, its silence broken only by the whisper of a channel breeze through an open window and the rhythmic, gentle scratching of quill pens on prepared animal skin. This was the scriptorium, the writing office. It was the library, the university, and the publishing house of the Anglo-Saxon world, all rolled into one. Here, monks engage in the slow, painstaking, and sacred work of creating books by hand. Each volume was a monumental undertaking. First, the skin of a calf or sheep had to be turned into vellum, a smooth and durable writing surface. Then, each sheet had to be ruled with faint, precise lines. The monk, or scribe, would then sit for hours, days, and months, patiently copying text from an older book, forming each letter with a pen cut from a goose feather, dipping it into ink made from oak galls or soot. This was not just about preserving knowledge. It was about creating objects of profound beauty for the glory of God. The supreme masterpiece of this age is a book known as the Lindisfarne Gospels, created around the year 700 in the very monastery where Saint Aidan had first established the Celtic mission. It is one of the most beautiful books in the world. Its pages explode with vibrant color and breathtakingly complex designs. It perfectly embodies the fusion of cultures that had just taken place. The intricate swirling patterns of knotwork and the fantastical birds and beasts that twist themselves into the shape of letters. This is the artistic genius of the Celtic and Germanic tradition. But the formal portraits of the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are copied directly from Roman models. It is a work of perfect synthesis. The wild, energetic spirit of the North married to the order and classicism of the Mediterranean, creating something entirely new and uniquely English. The greatest mind and the quiet hero of this Northumbrian golden age was a man who likely never saw the Lindisfarne Gospels. He lived his entire humble life just a few miles away at the monastery of Jarrow. His name was Bede. Bede was arguably the most learned man in Europe in his time. He was a true polymath who wrote on science, music, poetry, and theology. He was the man who popularized the system of dating years from the birth of Christ, the AD system we still use today. But his masterpiece, the work that has earned him the title, the father of English history, is his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, the ecclesiastical history of the English people. Bede's book is a miracle. Without it, the entire period we have been discussing would be a near total mystery, a dark age illuminated only by a few terse entries in a chronicle and the silent evidence of archaeology. Bede is the one who tells us the story of Pope Gregory and the angel-like slaves, of Augustine's landing in Kent, and of the great debate at the Synod of Whitby. But he was more than just a storyteller. He was a careful historian. In an age of myth and legend, he painstakingly collected his sources. He wrote letters to other monasteries, all over the country, asking for their records. He cited his authorities and was careful to distinguish what he knew as fact from what he had only heard as rumor. More than that, Bede was the first person to think of the diverse, warring peoples in Britain, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, as a single entity. The English people, the gens Anglorum. It was their shared Christian faith, he argued, that bound them together and made them one. In a very real sense, the idea of England was born in the quiet mind of this humble monk in his study at Jarrow. This Northumbrian Renaissance was a beautiful, brilliant, but ultimately fragile thing. While Bede was writing his great history and the monks of Lindisfarne were illuminating their gospels, the world outside the monastery walls remained a violent and uncertain place. The kings who patronized these great works were still waging brutal wars, being ambushed and killed by their rivals. This golden age was a precious island of peace and scholarship in a very stormy sea, and from their island monasteries the monks would look out across the gray, cold waters of the North Sea, the ancient highway of their ancestors, never imagining that this same sea would soon bring the wave of violence that would wash their world away. While the quiet labors of the scriptorium were creating a new spiritual and intellectual world, the arrival of Christianity was having another equally profound effect on Anglo-Saxon society. It was transforming the very idea of kingship and the nature of law. The world of the pagan Saxons had been governed by a complex web of unwritten rules, a powerful oral tradition of custom and kinship that was known and understood by all, but existed only in the collective memory. The missionaries from Rome, however, brought with them not just the Bible, but also the legacy of the Roman Empire, the idea of written, codified law. In the first Anglo-Saxon king to embrace this powerful new tool was Ethelbert of Kent, the very same king who had first welcomed Augustine. Sometime around the year 602, not long after his own baptism, Ethelbert issued a set of laws, or dooms. This was a revolutionary act. The short document, consisting of just 90 clauses, was the first set of laws ever written down in any Germanic language. It was the very beginning of English prose. For the first time, a king's authority was not just something to be witnessed in the feasting of the mead hall or on the field of battle. It was something that could be written down, copied, and preserved, fixed, and unchanging. It marked a huge step away from purely tribal leadership and towards the beginnings of a structured, administrative state. But these early law codes were not like a modern legal textbook, attempting to cover every possible crime. The vast oceans of customary law, the rules of inheritance, of land ownership, of social obligation, remained unwritten, as it was simply the water that everyone swam in. Ethelbert's code, and the ones that followed from other kings, were more like a set of royal amendments. They were a declaration of the specific issues the king felt were most important to regulate, a list of the problems he wanted to solve, and the social relationships he most wanted to define. Reading Ethelbert's laws is like looking at a detailed price list for social harmony. They are incredibly, almost bizarrely specific about the compensation to be paid for physical injuries. A staggering number of clauses are dedicated to this, creating a tariff for the human body. If you broke someone's thigh, you had to pay a fine, or bot, of 12 shillings. If you struck a man on the nose, 3 shillings. The loss of a front tooth was worth 6 shillings, a canine tooth 4, a molar just 1. Even the fingernails were accounted for, 1 shilling for a thumbnail, 6 pence for the nail of the index finger. It seems strange to us now, but this detailed accounting was the very bedrock of their legal system. This system was designed to control the most destructive force in their society, the blood feud. The core principle was the ancient Germanic concept of the Wehrgeld, literally the man price. Every free person in the kingdom had a value placed upon their life, determined by their social rank. A nobleman, a thegn, might be worth 200 shillings. A simple freeman, a seaoral, was worth 200. If you killed a man, you did not necessarily face execution by the state. Instead, you owed his kin his wehrgeld. The payment of this blood money was the recognized way to make peace, to prevent a single killing from spiraling into an endless, reciprocal cycle of vengeance that could tear families and entire communities apart. The detailed fines for lesser injuries were simply fractions of this total man price. Causing an injury was, in a legal sense, a temporary killing of part of a person's value and function, and the payment was designed to restore that value and prevent further violence. What makes these early Christian law codes so fascinating is how they expertly blend this ancient pagan social mechanism with the new priorities of the Christian faith. The very first clause in Ethelbert's code announces a new reality. The property of God and the church, it reads, is to be compensated 12-fold. Stealing from the new Christian establishment was the most expensive crime you could commit. The code goes on to set the fines for injuring a bishop, 11-fold compensation, a priest, 9-fold, and so on. The king was using the traditional tools of Germanic law, the fine, the compensation payment, to protect and legitimize the new religion. It was a perfect fusion of the two worlds. Later kings, like Ine of Wessex in the late 7th century, built on these foundations, issuing longer and more complex laws that dealt with everything from theft and banditry to agricultural practices and the legal status of the native British population living under Saxon rule. Justice itself was a public community affair. A person accused of a crime could often clear themselves by swearing a solemn oath of their innocence, but they had to be supported by a number of oath helpers, respected neighbors who would swear to their good character. Your reputation was your primary legal defense. For the most serious crimes, or for those who could not find oath helpers, the case might be turned over to the judgment of God in the form of an ordeal, a trial by hot iron or cold water, or the speed of a wound's healing, or whether a person sank or floated, was believed to be a divine sign of guilt or innocence. It was a legal world built on compensation rather than punishment, on community reputation, and a deep-seated belief that both the ancient customs of the ancestors and the will of the new Christian God were present in the dispensing of justice. While the Anglo-Saxons in Britain were slowly and at times painfully building a new Christian civilization of monasteries, law codes, and intricate art, a very different fate was unfolding for their cousins who had remained behind on the continent. For centuries, the Saxons of northern Germany, the people we now call the Old Saxons, had lived much as their ancestors had. They were a loose confederation of tribes, occupying the vast forested plains and marshlands between the river Elbe and the Rhine. They had no single king, were fiercely independent, and remained stubbornly loyal to their ancient pagan gods, to Woden, Thunor, and the sacred groves where they worshipped. They were a remnant of an older world, a pocket of fierce paganism lodged on the border of a rapidly changing Europe, and on that border a new superpower had arisen. To their south and west lay the sprawling, aggressive, and powerfully organized empire of the Franks, and at its head was the most formidable ruler in Europe since the fall of Rome, Charles the Great, King of the Franks, known to history as Charlemagne. Charlemagne was a man of immense physical energy, boundless ambition, and a piety that was as sincere as it was ruthless. He saw himself as a new Christian emperor, a protector of the faith tasked by God with uniting the peoples of Western Europe into a single holy empire. The pagan Saxons on his northeastern frontier were, in his eyes, an intolerable problem. They were a source of constant raiding, a refuge for his enemies, and most damningly, a blasphemous affront to his God. They had to be conquered, converted, and absorbed. In the year 772, Charlemagne launched the first of what would become a series of 18 brutal campaigns, a conflict that would last for more than 30 years. These were the Saxon Wars, and they were a struggle of shocking ferocity. This was not a war of gentle persuasion. From the very beginning, Charlemagne made it clear that this was a war against the Saxon religion itself. His first major act was to march his army deep into Saxon territory to one of their most sacred sites and destroy a holy object known as the Irminsul. We don't know exactly what it was, perhaps a massive revered tree trunk or a carved wooden pillar, but it was likely a symbol of their world tree, the cosmic pillar that the Saxons believed connected the earth to the heavens. By cutting it down and looting its sanctuary, Charlemagne was sending a clear message. His God was stronger than theirs. He was taking an axe to the very root of their cosmos. The pattern of the next 3 decades was a grim and exhausting cycle. Charlemagne, with his superior army of heavily armed cavalry, would invade Saxony, defeat the disorganized Saxon warriors in open battle, and enforce his terms. He would compel the Saxon nobles, the edilingui, to swear oaths of loyalty, and most importantly, to accept Christian baptism. He would take their sons as hostages and return to his own lands, leaving behind Frankish garrisons in newly built forts. And as soon as his main army was gone, the Saxons would rebel. They would renounce their forced baptisms, swarm the Frankish forts, burn the new churches, kill the priests, and melt back into the forests and swamps where the Frankish cavalry could not easily follow. For years, the Saxon resistance was a local and fractured affair. But as the war ground on, a leader emerged, a nobleman named Widukind, who became the heart and soul of the Saxon struggle. We know of him only through the writings of his enemies, the Franks, who portray him as a cunning and determined arch-rebel. He was the ghost in the forest, the man who would rally the warriors for one more uprising, one more desperate fight for the old ways. The war reached its ugliest point in the year 782, after Widukind had masterminded a successful ambush that wiped out an entire Frankish army. A furious Charlemagne marched back into Saxony, demanding that the rebels be handed over. According to the Frankish royal annals, 4,500 Saxon warriors who had been implicated in the uprising were surrendered to the king at a place called Verden. There, In a terrifying display of imperial wrath, Charlemagne ordered them all to be executed in a single day. The massacre of Verdun was an act of calculated state terror designed to shatter the Saxon will to resist once and for all. But even this did not end the war. It took another 2 decades of brutal campaigning, of mass deportations of Saxon families to other parts of the empire, and the imposition of terrifying new laws that made pagan practices, from cremating the dead to refusing baptism, a crime punishable by death. Eventually, the sheer relentless weight of the Frankish war machine was too much. In 785, even the great rebel Wedekind was finally forced to surrender, and in a great symbolic ceremony, with Charlemagne himself acting as his godfather, he was baptized. The resistance was broken. The fate of the 2 branches of the Saxon people could not have been more different. The Anglo-Saxons in Britain, through a slow process of conversion and cultural fusion, had built a series of uniquely English Christian kingdoms. The old Saxons on the continent were brutally conquered, their native culture systematically dismantled, and their lands incorporated into a vast continental empire. Their long, bloody, and tragic fight for the gods of their ancestors was over. With the last embers of pagan Saxon resistance stamped out on the continent, the story of the Saxons now belonged entirely to the Anglo-Saxons of Britain. Their collection of kingdoms, though still prone to bickering and rivalry, had forged a vibrant and confident Christian culture. The monasteries were thriving, the kings were issuing laws, and the island, for all its internal squabbles, seemed relatively secure and at peace. But the sea that had first brought the Saxons to Britain, and which had connected their new Christian kingdoms to the wider world of European learning, was about to become a highway for a new and terrifying force. They came from the lands of the north, from the deep, splintered fjords of Norway, the forests of Sweden, and the flat, fertile plains of Denmark. To the Anglo-Saxons, these Scandinavians were not entirely alien. They were, in a sense, distant cousins, a people who spoke a related Germanic language, and who still worshipped the old gods, Woden, whom they called Odin, and Thunor, whom they called Thor. But in the centuries since the Saxons had left those northern shores, these Norsemen had perfected a piece of technology that would allow them to unleash an age of terror upon their neighbors, the longship. The Viking longship was a masterpiece of naval engineering, a vessel perfectly designed for its violent purpose. It was long, narrow, and frighteningly fast, its single square sail catching the wind to power it across the open ocean. But its true genius lay in its shallow draft. The ship sat high in the water, meaning it did not need a deep harbor to make land. It could simply run itself up onto any sandy beach, allowing its crew to disembark and attack with breathtaking speed. Furthermore, its light weight and the banks of oars that lined its sides meant it could leave the sea behind, navigating far up shallow rivers and estuaries, striking at towns and monasteries deep inland that had never before considered themselves vulnerable to attack from the sea. It was a weapon in its own right, a sea serpent of wood and iron that could appear without warning and vanish just as quickly. For years, there had been troubling signs. A short entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 789 notes the arrival of 3 strange ships on the coast of Wessex. When the local king's official, the reeve, rode down to the shore to ask who they were and to demand they pay the king's trading tax, they slew him. It was a small, as sharp shock, a hint of a new and ruthless breed of seafarer. But it was 4 years later, in the summer of 793, that the true nature of the threat was revealed in an attack of such shocking brutality that it sent a tremor of fear through the entire Christian world. The target was Lindisfarne, the holy island, the cradle of Northumbrian Christianity, a place of serene prayer and scholarship, home to the bones of saints and the creators of the magnificent Gospels. It was one of the most sacred places in Britain. It was also immensely wealthy, and being an island of pacifist monks, completely undefended. On the 8th of June, the dragon prows appeared on the horizon. The monks, looking out at the calm sea, would have had no idea what was coming. The Norse warriors swarmed ashore, a whirlwind of pagan violence, in a place of Christian peace. The scholar Alcuin, a Northumbrian working in the court of Charlemagne, cried out in a letter when he heard the news. "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain," he wrote. "The church of Saint Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples. The raiders plundered the church of its treasures, the silver chalices, the golden crosses, the jewel-encrusted book covers. They burned the monastic buildings, killed many of the monks where they stood, and dragged others away in chains to be sold as slaves. The sheer sacrilege was what caused the most profound horror. These men did not just steal wealth, they defiled the altars of God and showed no fear of the saints. To the Anglo-Saxons, it was as if the demons of hell itself had been unleashed upon them. Why did this age of raiding begin so suddenly? Historians have debated the causes for centuries. Perhaps it was overpopulation in the harsh lands of Scandinavia, forcing young men to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Perhaps it was a political reaction as powerful kings began to consolidate power in Norway and Denmark, forcing rival chieftains and their followers into exile. Or perhaps it was simply that the Scandinavians, through trade and exploration, had become aware of the riches that lay just a few days' sail away in the poorly defended kingdoms of their neighbors. It was likely a perfect storm of all these factors, a sudden explosion of violent energy from the north. The raid on Lindisfarne was not an isolated event. It was the beginning. In the years that followed, the dragon ships became a terrifyingly familiar sight all around the coasts of Britain and Ireland. Other great monasteries, like Jarrow, the home of Bede, were plundered. The raids grew more frequent, the fleets grew larger, and the Anglo-Saxon kings scrambled to organize some form of coastal defense. The golden age of peaceful scholarship was over. A new age had dawned, an age defined by the cry of the watchman, the smoke of burning churches, and the sharp, cruel edge of the Viking axe. For several decades after the traumatic raid on Lindisfarne, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms existed in a state of low-grade, simmering fear. The attacks from the north were a constant threat, but they were, for the most part, seasonal and predictable. The dragon ships would appear in the summer, strike a vulnerable coastal settlement or monastery, and then vanish with their plunder before the autumn storms, returning to their Scandinavian homelands to wait out the winter. It was a terrifying and destructive problem, but it was in a way manageable. The kingdoms bled, but they survived. Then, in the autumn of 865, The nature of the game changed completely. A new fleet arrived on the shores of East Anglia, but this was different. This was not a raiding party, it was an army. The scribes of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, writing with a sense of dawning horror, gave it a simple, ominous name, the Mysel here, the Great Army. It was a force unlike any seen before, a coalition of war bands from all over the Scandinavian world, numbering in the thousands, a mobile city of warriors. They had not come for a summer of plunder. They had come to stay. They had come to conquer. Their strategy was new and terrifyingly effective. Upon landing in East Anglia, the army did not immediately begin to raid. Instead, they dug in, creating a massive fortified camp. From this secure base, they did not demand plunder, but tribute. The local East Anglian king, unnerved by the sheer size of the force on his doorstep, was forced into a humiliating peace. He had to provide the Viking army with food, supplies, and most crucially, horses. The great army was now a highly mobile force, able to move with a speed on land that had previously been reserved for their ships at sea. Who led this formidable force? The later Norse sagas, thrilling tales of heroes and gods, give us a very clear and dramatic answer. They say the army was led by the sons of the legendary Viking hero, Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar Hairy Trousers. Chief among them were Ivar the Boneless, a man famed for his cunning and intellect, and his brothers Halfdan and Ubba. The sagas claim their invasion was an act of epic vengeance. Their father, Ragnar, had been captured by Aella, the king of Northumbria, and executed by being cast into a pit of vipers. The great army in this telling was a furious response, the little pigs coming to avenge the death of the old boar. It is a magnificent story, but its historical truth is uncertain. Ragnar himself is a figure who hovers in the mists between myth and reality. It is more likely that the leaders of the army were simply ambitious and brilliant warlords, and that the grand story of revenge was woven around them later to give their conquest the sheen of a heroic epic. Whatever their motivation, the army's progress was relentless. In 866, their new cavalry force rode north from East Anglia into the kingdom of Northumbria, the old heartland of the golden age of Bede and the Lindisfarne Gospels. They found a kingdom paralyzed by a bitter civil war between two rival claimants to the throne, one of whom was the very same King Aella of the Ragnar legend. The Vikings exploited this division perfectly. They seized the great northern city of York, the Roman Eboracum, which they called Jorvik. When the two foolish Northumbrian kings finally united to try and retake the city, they were lured into a trap and utterly destroyed. Both kings were killed, and the great army became the masters of Northumbria. The most prestigious kingdom in England had been conquered in less than 2 years. After securing the north, the army turned its attention south again, marching into East Anglia in 869. This time, they were not looking for tribute. The local king, Edmund, raised his own army and fought back. He was defeated, captured, and according to the legend that would make him a saint, martyred for his faith. The story tells that he refused Ivar's demand to renounce Christ and rule as a vassal. In a display of ritual cruelty, he was tied to a tree, shot so full of arrows that he resembled a porcupine, and then beheaded. The kingdom of the East Angles was no more. 2 great kingdoms were now gone. Only Mercia and Wessex remained. In 874, After years of skirmishing and extorting tribute, the army made its final move against Mercia, the great military power of the English Midlands. They did not conquer it in a great battle, but simply broke it. They drove the Mercian king, Burgred, into a terrified exile. He fled all the way to Rome, where he died, and they placed a puppet ruler, a foolish king's thane, on the Mercian throne. In less than a decade, the great heathen army had systematically shattered the old political order of Anglo-Saxon England. Northumbria's was a Viking kingdom. East Anglia had been absorbed. Mercia was a broken vassal state. The old Heptarchy was a distant memory. The entire political and military weight of the Viking army, now battle-hardened and enriched by the plunder of 3 kingdoms, turned its gaze south towards the last Saxon kingdom, the last bastion of English independence, the kingdom of the West Saxons. And so, the full, terrifying weight of the great heathen army, an undefeated force that had shattered 3 of England's 4 great kingdoms, was now poised to fall upon the last one. Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, stood alone. For centuries, it had been just one of several competing kingdoms, often overshadowed by the power of Mercia or the cultural prestige of Northumbria. Now, through a brutal process of elimination, this one Saxon kingdom had become the final bastion of English independence, the last flickering candle of a culture that was on the verge of being extinguished forever. The fight for Wessex was now a fight for the very survival of the English people. Facing this existential threat were 2 brothers, the last of a line of West Saxon kings. The ruler was King Ethelred, and at his side was his much younger brother, a man in his early 20s named Alfred. Together, they prepared their kingdom for the storm they knew was coming. It broke upon them in the winter of 870. The great army, led by the Viking kings Halfdan and Bagsekji, surged south into the heart of Wessex. They seized the royal estate at Reading, establishing a formidable fortified camp on a spit of land between the rivers Thames and Kennet, and from this base they began to ravage the kingdom. What followed was a year of almost unimaginable violence, a desperate, bloody struggle that would become known as Alfred's Year of Battles. The fighting was not a slow, strategic campaign, but a rapid and brutal series of clashes as the 2 armies met, withdrew, and met again in a furious, close-quarters contest for supremacy. The West Saxons drew first blood in a skirmish at Inglefield, a small victory that proved the Vikings were not invincible. But a few days later, when Ethelred and Alfred tried to storm the main Viking camp at Reading, they were thrown back with heavy losses. The initial shock of the invasion had now been met with the grim reality of the great army's military prowess. The decisive battle of the campaign was fought about a week later, high on the windswept chalk ridges of the Berkshire Downs. The battle is known as Ashdown. The Viking army had seized the high ground, a great psychological and tactical advantage. The West Saxon army, the Fyrd, had marched up to meet them and drew up in 2 divisions. One was commanded by King Ethelred, the other by the young Alfred. And here, in the account of the battle, left to us by Alfred's biographer, Bishop Asser, we have a moment of almost unbearable tension. King Ethelred was in his tent, hearing Mass, and refused to move until the priest had finished, declaring that he would not abandon the service of God for the service of men. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, The Viking army, confident on their high ground, began to advance. Alfred, watching them come, was faced with an impossible choice. He could hold his ground as ordered and risk his division being overwhelmed before his brother, the king, arrived, or he could disobey orders and lead his men in a desperate, uphill charge against a superior position. He chose to charge. A sayer tells us that Alfred, like a wild boar, led his men up the slope, crashing into the Viking shield wall. For hours, a terrible, grinding battle raged on that high ridge. It was a chaotic, brutal slog of shield against shield, of axe and sword and spear. Alfred's bold charge had saved the army from being routed, but it was not enough to win. Only when King Ethelred, his prayers finally complete, arrived with his division, did the tide of battle finally turn. In the chaos, the Viking king Bagsec was cut down, and the Viking army finally broke and fled back towards their camp at Reading. It was a stunning, glorious, but cripplingly expensive victory. The West Saxons had done what no other English army had managed to do. They had met the great heathen army in open battle and defeated them. But this was a war of attrition. The Vikings could absorb the loss. The West Saxons, with their finite supply of fighting men, could not. 2 weeks later, the two armies met again at Basing, and this time the Vikings were victorious. 2 months after that, they fought again at a place called Merton, another bloody and inconclusive battle in which the West Saxons were eventually forced to retreat. Sometime shortly after the Battle of Merton, King Ethelred died. He was buried at Wimborne Minster, a king who had fought tirelessly to save his kingdom. He had not failed, but he had not succeeded either. In his place, in the midst of a war for survival, the Council of the West Saxons acclaimed his younger brother as their king. Alfred, now just 22 years old, inherited a crown, a kingdom, and a war that seemed impossible to win. With his army bled white by the year of battles, Alfred was forced to do what must have been a bitter and humiliating thing. He made peace with the Vikings. This was a polite euphemism. In reality, he paid them a huge sum of silver and gold to leave his kingdom. For the Vikings, it was a good deal. They had been fought to a standstill and decided that a handsome payoff was a better outcome than another bloody year of fighting the stubborn West Saxons. They withdrew from Wessex to lick their wounds and overwinter in the captured city of London. For Alfred, it was not a victory, but a desperately needed reprieve. Wessex, alone among the Saxon kingdoms, had survived the storm. It was battered, impoverished, and exhausted, but it was still standing. A fragile, temporary peace settled over the land. The Vikings were gone, but everyone, especially the young new king, knew they would be back. The peace that King Alfred had bought with West Saxon silver was a fragile and temporary thing. It was not a treaty. It was a ceasefire, a paying of protection money. For Alfred and his kingdom, it was a precious chance to breathe and regroup. For the Vikings, it was simply a strategic pause. Having been checked in the south, the great army turned its attention to consolidating its gains elsewhere. They marched back into Mercia, formally partitioned it, and gave the western half to their puppet king, while the eastern half was settled by their own warriors. They did the same in Northumbria. The Viking soldiers began to beat their swords into plowshares, taking up land, becoming farmers and landlords. The great conquest was becoming a permanent occupation. For a few years, an uneasy calm settled over the island, but the threat had not gone away. It had simply changed its shape. A new Viking army, fresh from raiding on the continent, arrived in England and joined forces with the A portion of the Great Army now based in Mercia. At their head was a powerful and ambitious king named Guthrum. This was no longer just an army of plunderers. It was now the military force of an established and growing power on English soil, a rival kingdom with its own king and its own ambitions. And Guthrum's ambition was to finish the job the great army had started, the complete conquest of Wessex. The blow, when it came, was delivered with a shocking speed and a brutal sense of timing. In the depths of the winter of 878, Alfred was at his royal estate in Chippenham, in Wiltshire. The court was celebrating Christmas and the Feast of Epiphany, or Twelfth Night. This was a sacred time, a time of feasting and peace, a time when armies did not march. Guthrum, respecting none of the conventions of Christian warfare, launched a surprise attack. He led his army on a lightning-fast winter campaign, catching the West Saxons completely off guard. They overran Chippenham, and Alfred was very nearly captured. The king, the last king of the English, was forced to flee for his life with only a small bodyguard of his most loyal household warriors. The kingdom of Wessex, which had resisted for so long, collapsed almost overnight. Stunned by the speed and ferocity of the winter attack, and with their king having vanished, the nobles and people of Wessex began to submit to the Vikings. Many fled in terror, seeking refuge across the Channel in Francia. To all intents and purposes, the last Saxon kingdom had fallen. The Viking conquest of England was complete. But Alfred was not dead, and he had not fled the country. He had become a fugitive in his own kingdom. He and his small band of followers found refuge in the most remote, inhospitable part of his realm, the great swamp of the Somerset Levels. This was a vast, watery wilderness, a maze of marshes, bogs, and tangled swampy forests, a landscape where firm ground was a rare and precious commodity. On a small island deep within this swamp, a place called Athelney, Alfred established a hidden fortress. It was from this last, desperate hideout that the King of Wessex, now a guerrilla leader, began to wage a secret war of resistance, launching small, harassing raids against the occupying army. It is from this bleak period, this absolute lowest point of Alfred's life and of Saxon history, that one of England's most beloved and enduring legends comes. The story tells that Alfred, alone and disguised as a peasant, sought shelter in the humble cottage of a swineherd's wife. The woman, unaware of who her guest was busy with her chores and asked the melancholy stranger to keep an eye on some small wheaten cakes she had baking on the hearth. But Alfred's mind was not on the cakes. He was utterly consumed by the catastrophic loss of his kingdom, his thoughts wrestling with the seemingly hopeless situation and planning his next move. Lost in these heavy thoughts, he completely forgot his duty, and the cakes began to smoke and burn. The woman returned, saw the ruined meal, and unleashed a furious tirade on the lazy, good-for-nothing vagabond, scolding him for being useless when he was so eager to eat. The king, the great ruler of the West Saxons, could do nothing but sit there and humbly accept the rebuke. The story is almost certainly just that, a story. It first appears in a biography written more than a century after the event, but it has survived because it tells a deeper, more important truth. It is a story that humanizes a great national hero, showing him at his moment of absolute defeat. It shows a king who has lost his throne, his army, and his finery, a man brought so low that he is scolded by a peasant woman in her own kitchen. It is a powerful parable about humility and about how, even in the darkest moment of despair, when all seems lost, the mind of the king was still working, the spark of resistance still alive. And that spark was slowly beginning to glow brighter. From his secret fort at Athelney, Alfred was sending out messengers, loyal riders who slipped through the marshes and rode through the Viking-held lands, carrying the king's summons. He was calling on the Fyrds, the local levies of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, to muster at a secret rendezvous. A small but crucial victory by one of his loyal noblemen in Devon had proven the Vikings could still be beaten. Alfred, having endured his ordeal in the wilderness, was now ready to emerge. He was about to make one final, desperate gamble to reclaim his kingdom and save his people. For 7 long weeks after the great feast of Easter in 878, King Alfred remained hidden in his marshy fortress at Athelney, a king only of swamps and shadows. But in that time, his secret messengers had been riding, carrying their lord's summons through the occupied shires of Wessex. Then, in the 7th week, he emerged. He rode out from the wilderness to a pre-arranged rallying point, a place called Egbert's Stone, on the border of Wiltshire and Somerset. And there, the kingdom of Wessex was reborn. From the farms and villages, the men of the West Saxon Fyrd, the militia who had not submitted to the Vikings, converged on the rallying point. The relief and joy at seeing their king, whom many must have presumed was dead or fled, was said to be immense. Alfred's biographer, Asser, writes that they received him as one restored to life after suffering such great tribulations. For 2 days, this new army, united by a desperate loyalty and a last flickering hope, marched across the downs. Alfred was not waiting to be attacked. He was seeking out his enemy. He found the main Viking army, under the command of King Guthrum, camped near a place called Eddington. There was no complex strategy, no clever maneuvering. Alfred drew his army up into a single, dense shield wall and advanced. The West Saxons, fighting for their homes, their families, and their very existence, slammed into the Viking line. The battle, we are told, was ferocious, a long, brutal, grinding affair of shield on shield, with men fighting hand to hand for hours. But the spirit Alfred had rekindled in his followers, and perhaps the sheer shock of facing a disciplined Saxon army where they had expected only scattered resistance, was enough. The Viking line broke. The great heathen army, which had terrorized England for over a decade, was shattered and put to flight. Alfred pursued them to their nearby fortress at Chippenham and laid siege. Trapped with their army defeated and their supplies cut off, the Vikings held out for 2 weeks before starvation and despair forced them to sue for peace. Guthrum surrendered. Alfred had not just won a skirmish, he had won a total and decisive victory. The military threat, for now, was over. But in the aftermath of this great triumph, Alfred showed his true genius. He understood that courage and a single victory were not enough. The old West Saxon system had failed. It had collapsed almost overnight. To prevent this from ever happening again, he needed to do more than just defeat the Vikings. He needed to completely re-engineer his kingdom for survival. It was in the years of peace that followed Eddington that Alfred forged the sword that would not just defend Wessex, but would one day build England. His first and most crucial reform was to the army itself. The Old Fyrd was a citizen militia, a temporary levy of farmers who were obligated to serve for a set period before returning to their fields. This meant that a Saxon king could never keep an army in the field for long, a fatal weakness against a permanent Viking force. Alfred's solution was simple and revolutionary. He split the Fyrd in two. At any one time, one half of the men would be on active service, manning the forts and ready to fight, while the other half remained at home, tending the farms and supporting the economy. The two halves would then rotate. For the first time, this gave the kingdom a permanent, standing army, a force that could respond instantly to any threat at any time of year. His second, and perhaps greatest innovation, was the creation of the burhal system. Alfred ordered the building of a network of over 30 fortified towns, or burhs, across his kingdom. These were not stone castles for noblemen, but large, scientifically planned defensive settlements for the people. A typical burh was a huge enclosure, protected by a massive earth rampart, likely topped with a timber palisade and surrounded by a wide ditch. They were strategically placed so that no village in Wessex was more than 20 miles, a single day's march, away from the safety of a burh. This system created a formidable defense in depth. Viking raiders could no longer sweep through the countryside unopposed. Wherever they went, a fortified garrison was nearby, ready to sally out and attack them, and a safe refuge was available for the local population and their livestock. These burhs were also made into centers of commerce, laying the foundations for the first real English towns. Finally, Alfred took the fight to the sea. He is often called the father of the English Navy. He understood that the best way to defeat Vikings was to stop them from ever landing. He sponsored the construction of a new fleet of ships, larger, faster, and with higher sides than the Viking longships, specifically designed to patrol the coast and intercept raiding fleets at sea. Through these interconnected reforms, the standing army, the fortified towns, and the new navy, Alfred had transformed his kingdom. He had found it vulnerable, reactive, and prone to collapse. He was rebuilding it to be resilient, proactive, and permanently mobilized for defense. He had won the battle at Eddington with courage and charisma. He would secure the long-term future of his people with something even more powerful: intelligent design. Now, with the military situation in hand, he could turn to the terms of peace with his defeated foe, Guthrum, and Alfred had a plan that was far more radical than simply sending him away. Having won the war, Alfred now had to secure the peace. With Guthrum and the remnants of the great army besieged and starving, the West Saxon king had his defeated enemy completely at his mercy. A more conventional and perhaps more ruthless ruler might have chosen to massacre them, to eliminate the threat once and for all, much as Charlemagne had done to the continental Saxons at Verdun a century before. But Alfred chose a path that was far more radical, a solution that was breathtaking in its political and spiritual audacity. He offered his enemy not a sword, but a baptismal font. His terms of surrender were simple: Guthrum and his 30 most important chieftains were to come to the Saxon court at Wedmore. There, they were to lay aside their pagan faith in the old gods of the north and accept Christianity. In an astonishing act of reconciliation, the Viking warlord who had so nearly destroyed the last English kingdom agreed. And in the ceremony that followed, King Alfred himself stood as Guthrum's godfather, lifting his old enemy from the waters of baptism as his own spiritual son. Guthrum was given a new Christian name, Athelstan. This was a masterstroke of statecraft. Alfred had not just defeated his rival, he had bound him to himself with the most sacred and personal oath recognized in their world, transforming an enemy into a kinsman. This was the first part of the settlement. The second part, formalized in a treaty a few years later, was a pragmatic and realistic acceptance of the new political map of England. The island was to be formally divided. A border was drawn across the country, a line running from the mouth of the River Thames, up the River Lee to its source, then cutting across the Midlands to Bedford, and from there following the old Roman road of Watling Street northwestwards. To the south and west of this line lay the lands that would be ruled by Alfred, his own kingdom of Wessex, and the English-speaking western half of Mercia. This was, for the first time, a single, unified Anglo-Saxon kingdom. To the north and east of the line lay the territory where the Vikings were to settle permanently, to live under their own leaders and their own laws. This vast swathe of England, comprising the old kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia and the eastern half of Mercia, became known as the Danelaw. It's important to understand what the Danelaw was and what it wasn't. It was not a single unified Viking empire. It was a geographical region, not a political one. Guthrum, now King Athelstan, went to rule as king of the Vikings, who were settling in East Anglia, but he had no authority over the Danes who had made their home in Northumbria or the Midlands. The Danelaw was a patchwork of different Viking jarldoms and smaller kingdoms, a frontier society where the law of the Danes was now the dominant force. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum had in effect created two Englands living side by side. For a generation, a fragile peace held. Though there were still skirmishes along the border, the Great War was over. Guthrum, to his credit, largely honored his oaths and kept the peace with his godfather until his death. In the towns and villages of the Danelaw, a new Anglo-Scandinavian culture began to emerge. The two languages, Old English and Old Norse, were similar enough that people could understand each other, and a host of Norse words began to pour into the English language. Everyday words like sky, skin, leg, window, husband, law, and anger are all Viking imports, ghosts of this period of intense cultural contact. The landscape itself was renamed. All across the north and east of England, you can still trace the boundaries of the Danelaw by looking at a map. Any village name ending in by, like Derby or Grimsby, meaning village, or thorp, meaning outlying farmstead, tells you that it was once a Viking settlement. For his part, Alfred's victory and his wise peace had transformed his status. By saving Wessex from destruction and liberating western Mercia from Viking control, including the vital port of London, which he rebuilt and refortified, he was now seen as more than just a regional king. The English people who were not under Danish rule, who had seen their own royal houses destroyed, now looked to Alfred of Wessex as their only protector, their only champion. The old rivalries of the Heptarchy were now meaningless in the face of this new, divided reality. For the first time, the scribes of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle stopped referring to him as merely the king of the West Saxons. They begin to give him a new title, one that reflects this new reality, King of the Anglo-Saxons. Alfred had not set out to create England. He had set out only to save his own small kingdom of Wessex. But in doing so, he had laid the foundations for something much larger. He had drawn a line across the country, and in defining the frontier of the Danelaw, he had also, for the first time, defined the borders of what could now be called England. The great task for the next generation, for the children and grandchildren of Alfred, would be to erase that line. The task of erasing the line that divided Saxon England from the Danelaw was a formidable one, a generational project that Alfred, for all his genius, did not live to complete. That great work fell to his children, who had inherited their father's resilience and strategic brilliance. His son, Edward, who became king after him, and his remarkable daughter, Ethelflatus, proved to be a formidable team. Ethelfleda had been married to the ruler of the English half of Mercia, and after her husband's death, she did something almost unheard of in that age. She ruled in her own right, earning the title Lady of the Mercians. She was a skilled strategist and a revered leader, a true warrior queen. Together, this brother and sister duo executed a brilliant, coordinated campaign to reclaim the lands of the Danelaw. It was a slow, methodical reconquest. Edward pushed north from his base in Wessex, while Ethelfleda pushed east and north from her heartland in Mercia. For every piece of territory they took, they secured it, extending their father's network of fortified burhs into the newly won lands, building fortresses and establishing garrisons. By the time of their deaths, they had succeeded in pushing the frontier of Anglo-Saxon rule all the way up to the Humber River, reclaiming the entirety of East Anglia and the Mercian Danelaw. The southern half of the line had been erased. The final climactic act of unification was left to the next generation, to Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, who came to the throne in 925. Raised in the court of his formidable aunt Ethelfleda, Athelstan was perhaps the most impressive of all the West Saxon kings. He was a fearsome warrior, a deeply pious man, a brilliant diplomat who married his sisters into the great royal houses of continental Europe, and a ruler with a grand vision of his own destiny. In 927, he marched his army north into the last great Viking kingdom, the Kingdom of York, the remnant of old Northumbria. He conquered the city, drove out the Norse king, and received the submission of the other rulers of the north. For the first time in history, a single king ruled all the lands that we would now recognize as England. Athelstan took on a new and glorious title for himself, Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain. This new unified English kingdom, forged in just 2 generations, was now the dominant power on the island, and its strength unnerved its neighbors. In 937, a massive alliance, a great army of a new kind, was formed with the single objective of crushing Athelstan and shattering his newfound English unity. The alliance was led by 3 powerful rulers: Olaf Guthfrithson, the Norse king of Dublin, who had his eyes on reclaiming the Viking kingdom of York; Constantine, the king of the Scots; and the king of Strathclyde, a Brittonic kingdom in what is now southern Scotland. It was a grand coalition of Vikings and Celts, the old enemies of the Anglo-Saxons, united against a common threat. A huge Viking fleet sailed from Ireland, and joining forces with their allies, they invaded the north of England. Athelstan, along with his younger half-brother Edmund, gathered the armies of Wessex and Mercia and marched north to meet them. The two great forces met at a place called Brunanburh. The Battle of Brunanburh is one of the most important and, frustratingly, one of the most mysterious battles in British history. We know it was a momentous event, but we have absolutely no idea where it was fought. The location of the battlefield is a complete mystery, a lost place that historians have sought for centuries, with dozens of potential sites suggested all over the north of England. While the location is lost, the story of the battle is preserved in a long, magnificent, and bloodthirsty poem in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The poem describes a vast, day-long, and incredibly ferocious fight. The West Saxons and Mercians, the sons of Edward, advanced and clove the shield wall, hacking their way through their enemies from sunrise to sunset. It depicts a scene of utter carnage. The field of battle grew dark with blood, the poet sings. When the battle was over, the great coalition had been annihilated. 5 young kings lay on that battlefield, the poem boasts, put to sleep by swords. Constantine of Scotland fled back to his homeland, and Olaf of Dublin, the poem says, was forced to escape back to Ireland in his ship over the dark water, a sad remnant. The victory at Brunanburh was absolute. It was a triumph that cemented the unification of England. It shattered the combined power of the Norse and Celtic kingdoms and confirmed that the House of Wessex was now the undisputed master of the island. Athelstan was no longer just a conqueror. He was the legitimate and proven ruler of a single, powerful English kingdom. He had finished the great work his grandfather Alfred had begun. The long, bloody struggle to reclaim the land from the heirs of the great heathen army was over. The Kingdom of England had been forged in the fires of war, and Athelstan, grandson of Alfred the Great, was its first true king. The great victory at Brunanburh had secured the new Kingdom of England. For the next half a century, under Athelstan's capable successors, his half-brother Edmund and his nephew Edgar, known as the Peaceful, the kingdom entered a kind of high summer. The constant, existential threat of the Vikings had receded, and the newly unified country enjoyed a period of remarkable peace, stability, and prosperity. This was the golden age of the late Saxon state, a time when the systems and structures put in place by Alfred the Great came to their full and impressive fruition. To an observer looking at England in the middle of the 10th century, it would have appeared to be one of the best governed and wealthiest kingdoms in all of Europe. The country was organized into a familiar system of shires, each with its own fortified boor, acting as an administrative and commercial center. Each shire was overseen by a royal official, the shire reeve or sheriff, who collected taxes and administered the king's justice. A single, reliable royal currency was used throughout the land, a sign of a powerful central government and a thriving economy. The old divisions between the Saxon lands of Wessex and the formerly Viking-held territories of the Danelaw were beginning to blur, as a single royal law was applied to all the king's subjects, whether their ancestors were from Saxony or from Scandinavia. This period of peace also witnessed a great spiritual and intellectual revival. Many of the old monasteries, which had been the centers of learning during the Age of Bede, had been destroyed or had fallen into decline during the Viking Wars. Now, a powerful new reform movement, led by brilliant and energetic churchmen like St. Dunstan, the Archbishop of Canterbury, swept through the land. This Benedictine reform sought to restore a strict, disciplined, and scholarly way of life to the English monasteries. Old houses were refounded and new ones were built, and they once again became incredible centers of art and learning. A second golden age of manuscript illumination began, producing some of the most beautiful and elegant books of the entire medieval period. It seemed as though the kingdom forged by the House of Wessex was not only secure, but was entering a period of lasting grace and sophistication. But beneath this placid and prosperous surface, the Anglo-Saxon political system had a critical structural weakness. The entire stability of this well-ordered state depended almost entirely on having a strong, capable adult king on the throne. The succession was not automatic. When a king died, his heir was not necessarily his eldest son. Any suitable male of the royal bloodline, a brother, a nephew, a cousin, could be chosen by the Witan, the great council of the kingdom's bishops and noblemen. This system worked well when there was a clear and competent candidate, but it could lead to chaos, factionalism, and even civil war if the succession was disputed or if the heir was a child. This weakness was brutally exposed after the death of the great King Edgar in 975. He left behind two young sons from different marriages, Edward and Ethelred. The great nobles of the kingdom immediately split into rival factions, each backing one of the boys. Edward the elder was crowned, but a few years later he was ambushed and murdered by members of his half-brother's faction. He would become known as Edward the Martyr, and his younger brother, a boy of about 10 years old, would take the throne. This was Ethelred. His reign had begun with a political assassination, an act that cast a dark shadow over the kingdom and revealed the deep and dangerous cracks in the foundations of the state. It was during the reign of this unlucky king that the storm returned. The Viking raids, which had all but ceased for a generation, began again in the 980s. But these were not the opportunistic attacks of the past. The political situation in Scandinavia had changed. The raiders were no longer independent chieftains seeking land and plunder. They were now professional, state-sponsored armies sent by the newly powerful and unified kingdoms of Denmark and Norway. These were national-level invasions led by formidable warrior kings like Svein Forkbeard of Denmark. Faced with this renewed and more dangerous threat, Ethelred made a series of disastrous decisions. He was known to posterity by the unfortunate nickname Ethelred the Unready. This is not, as is often thought, a comment on his preparedness. It is a cruel pun on his name. In Old English, Ethelred means noble counsel. Unread, which sounds very similar, means no counsel or ill-advised. He was Ethelred the Ill-Advised, a king who consistently took bad advice. His primary policy for dealing with the Viking fleets was to pay them to leave. He raised huge national taxes on his wealthy kingdom to gather enormous sums of silver, which he paid to the raiders as tribute. This policy became known as the Danigelds. It was a catastrophic failure. Far from solving the problem, It advertised England's weakness and its immense wealth, making it an irresistible target. The payments only encouraged the raiders to come back the next year with a bigger fleet, demanding even more. The high summer of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom was over. The combination of a weak and poorly led king, a politically divided nobility, and a new, more formidable wave of Viking attacks brought the prosperous, sophisticated kingdom of Edgar to its knees. The wealth that had been the sign of its success had now become the magnet for its destruction. The disastrous reign of Ethelred the Ill-Advised, with its crippling Danegeld payments, ended in the complete conquest of England by the Danish king Knut the Great. Thus, for a time, England was part of a vast North Sea empire, ruled from Denmark. But after the death of Knut and his sons, the House of Wessex was restored in the form of Ethelred's son, Edward, a deeply pious and gentle man who would be known to history as Edward the Confessor. Edward ruled for over 20 years and gave the kingdom a much-needed period of peace. But he had one fatal flaw as a medieval king. He was childless. And in January of 1066, as the old king lay dying, the great and prosperous kingdom of England held its breath, for there was no clear air, and a storm was gathering. 3 men believed they had a right to the throne. The first was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex. He was the most powerful man in England, the king's brother-in-law, a proven military commander, and an Englishman. His claim was one of proximity and merit, and his supporters claimed he had been nominated as the successor by King Edward on his very deathbed. The second was William, Duke of Normandy. He was the formidable and ruthless ruler of a powerful, militarized duchy in northern France. His claim was based on a distant blood relationship to the old king, but more importantly, on a promise. He alleged that years before, Harold Godwinson had been shipwrecked in Normandy and had sworn a sacred oath on holy relics to support William's claim to the throne. The third was Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway. His name meant hard ruler, and he was the most famous and feared warrior of his age, a veteran of brutal campaigns from Russia to Sicily. His claim was tenuous, based on an old political deal, but it was really the ancient claim of the Vikings, the right of conquest. King Edward died on the 5th of January. The very next day, the English Witan met and, wasting no time, elected Harold Godwinson. He was crowned King Harold II and immediately began preparing for the invasions he knew were coming. He gathered the English fleet and the Fyrd, the great militia of the kingdom, and for the entire summer of 1066, he waited on the south coast, staring across the channel, waiting for William's fleet to appear. But William did not come. An unfavorable north wind blew relentlessly in the English Channel, keeping the Norman invasion fleet pinned in its harbor. All through July and August, Harold's army waited, but this was a citizen army of farmers. Their supplies were dwindling, and the harvest was waiting in their fields at home. In early September, with no invasion in sight, Harold had to make a difficult choice. He disbanded the army and let the men go home. It was a calculated risk that would prove to be a catastrophic stroke of bad luck. For just as the south coast was left undefended, the news arrived that Harold had dreaded. Harald Hardrada of Norway had invaded. Along with Harold's own treacherous, exiled brother Tostig, the Norwegian king had sailed up the river Humber with a fleet of 300 ships and had already defeated the northern English earls. In response, King Harold did something extraordinary. He gathered his elite professional soldiers, his housecarls, and in a feat of incredible speed and endurance, he force-marched them north, covering the 185 miles from London to York in just 4 days. On the 25th of September, he fell upon the Norwegian army at a place called Stamford Bridge. The invaders were caught completely by surprise, lounging in the sun, many without their mail shirts. The battle was a brutal and bloody affair, but the outcome was never in doubt. The English army smashed the Norwegian force. Harold Hardrada was killed, struck in the throat by an arrow. Harold's brother Tostig was also slain. Of the 300 ships that had brought the invaders, fewer than 25 were needed to carry the survivors home. It was one of the greatest and most decisive victories in English history, and the traditional endpoint of the Viking Age. Harold had won a magnificent victory, but his army was battered and exhausted. And it was at this moment of triumph, just 3 days after the battle, that a messenger arrived, breathless from riding day and night. The wind in the Channel had changed. William of Normandy had landed his army at Pevensey and was now ravaging the south coast. Harold was faced with another epic march. He turned his weary army around and raced back south, gathering what fresh troops he could along the way. On the 14th of October, the two armies met on a low ridge 7 miles from the town of Hastings. Harold's army, exhausted from 2 forced marches and a major battle, took up a defensive position on the high ground, forming the classic Anglo-Saxon shield wall, a tightly packed barrier of shields, spears, and axes. For most of the day, the English were winning. The Norman army, a force of cavalry, archers, and infantry, struggled to attack the uphill position. William's knights charged the shield wall again and again, but could not break it. His archers fired their arrows up the slope with little effect. At several points, the Normans fell back in disarray, and it was only William's personal courage that rallied them. The battle was a grim stalemate for over 8 hours. The turning point came when parts of the less disciplined English militia were lured into breaking the shield wall, chasing after Norman knights who were only feigning retreat. Once on the lower ground, they were surrounded and cut to pieces. Gaps began to appear in the English line. As evening began to fall, in the final desperate fighting around the English standard, Harold Godwinson was killed. The Bayeux Tapestry famously depicts him being struck in the eye by an arrow, though it is more likely he was cut down by a squad of Norman knights. With the king dead, the shield wall finally broke, and the English army dissolved in flight. William the Conqueror marched on London and was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. The Anglo-Saxon state, which had been founded by warrior mercenaries 6 centuries earlier, had come to a violent end, its last king lying dead on a battlefield in Sussex. A new age, the Norman Age, had begun, and so, with the body of the last Saxon king lying broken on a Sussex hillside and a Norman duke crowned in London, the 600-year story of Anglo-Saxon England came to a sudden and violent end. The Norman conquest was not just a change of dynasty. It was a social and cultural revolution. Within a single generation, the old English aristocracy was almost entirely dispossessed, its lands and titles handed over to William's French-speaking followers. A new language, Norman French, became the language of the court, of the law, of government, and of power. The landscape itself was transformed as the new lords built hundreds of grim, intimidating stone castles, physical symbols of their dominance over the conquered population. It seemed as though the vibrant, sophisticated culture of the Anglo-Saxons was to be entirely swept away, a dead end in the path of history. But a kingdom is more than its ruling class. The Normans were a small elite. A thin layer of cream floated on top of a vast, deep vessel of English life. And while the lords and bishops spoke French, the farmers in the fields, the merchants in the towns, the mothers singing to their children, they all continued to speak English. And it is here, in the resilience of language, that we find the most profound and enduring legacy of the Saxons. Our language, the one you are hearing and thinking in right now, is a direct descendant of theirs. The Normans flooded our vocabulary with thousands of new words, elegant and sophisticated terms for law, jury, verdict, government, parliament, nation, and fine dining. We cook with pork and beef, but the Saxons raised the swine and cows. But the bedrock, the very foundation of our language, remains stubbornly, powerfully Anglo-Saxon. All the small, strong, everyday words, the words for the things that truly matter, are theirs. Words like love, hate, home, house, man, woman, child, friend. The words for the body, head, heart, hand, foot. The words for the world, earth, water, sun, moon. The grammar, the structure, the very bones of our sentences. It all comes from the tongue of the people who first settled those eastern shores. The Norman words are the fancy wallpaper, but the Saxon words are the timber frame of the house itself. This deep continuity can be seen in other ways too. The Normans were master administrators, but they did not build their new state on empty ground. They adopted and adapted the highly effective systems of governance that the Saxon kings had already created. The division of the country into shires, each managed by a sheriff, was a Saxon invention that the Normans kept and strengthened. The idea of a single, common law that applied to the entire kingdom, a project begun by Alfred and his successors, became the foundation of the English common law system that would spread across the world. Even the physical landscape we see today is a ghost of their world. The winding country lanes, the layout of ancient villages, the boundaries of old parishes and fields, so many were first marked out by a Saxon farmer with his ox plow over 1,000 years ago. Over the centuries that followed, the two cultures, Norman and Saxon, slowly began to merge. The French-speaking lords began to intermarry with the English population. They began to speak English, a language now enriched and expanded by its encounter with French. By the 14th century, the old distinctions had become meaningless. A new, hybrid English identity had emerged, a people whose character was built upon a stoic and resilient Saxon foundation, but who had been shaped and sharpened by the influence of both the Vikings and the Normans. And so our long journey comes to its end. We have followed the people of the Sayax knife from their marshland homes on the North Sea coast, watched them cross the water to a broken Roman province, and seen them build a new world of mead halls and rival kingdoms. We have seen them bow before the cross, create works of breathtaking beauty in their northern monasteries, and then fight for their very survival against the dragon ships. We have stood with Alfred in the wilderness and with the last herald on the hill at Hastings. Their kingdom is gone, vanished into the mists of time, but their echo remains. It is in the names of the towns we live in the laws we follow, and most intimately of all, in the very words we use to name our world and speak our thoughts. The long story of the Saxons is over, but we are, all of us in the English-speaking world, still living in its wake. And now, as the story fades, perhaps you can feel the quiet of the room around you. The past recedes, and the gentle, peaceful dark remains. Let the echoes of those old kings and ancient battles soften and dissolve, leaving only stillness. There is nothing more to strive for, nothing more to learn. It is all done. It is time now to simply rest. Sleep well.